Hey, 8363MTR, what brings you into town?
Well, I had a video that I wanted to cover, and I was wondering if you'd be interested in a co-op.
Really? What video do you have in mind?
Mr. Enter's video on modern PSAs. He essentially made a review of things like the Steven Universe PSAs on racism and the Arthur PSA on mask. Yeah, it's like a year old at this point, but I still didn't like the video at all.
Wow, neither did I, so let's do this. Also, we're skipping the first 5 or so minutes because it takes that long for Enter to actually start reviewing a fucking PSA.
And I think we need something really simple to get started with. What is the least controversial topic that we can start with today?
Global warming.
I'm sorry, but who in the ever-living flying fuck is this robot here? Last time I checked, this robot wasn't in any prior Enter videos here, so I'm at a complete loss.
Okay, well, I'm fucked. It's all downhill from here, kids.
Okay, so we're not going to address the robot in the room? Okay, cool. Love the confusion on this.
For the record, as a longtime fan of Enter, I know he's done stuff like this before. Some of his older videos had an old man character, for example, who would occasionally guide Enter when he needed it. However, that character first appeared in his In Search of the Titanic, aka Tentaclino, review, and oh yeah, Enter didn't immediately expect us to know who he was, hence why he was actually given an introduction.
Wait, the 23rd's coming up. I've got one animated atrocity left, and then I could start reviewing episodes of MLP again. And the next one is, oh goody, a 6th episode. That means a G3 special.
No, my son. There is one thing you must do before you return to Friendship as Magic. One you have been delaying from the very beginning.
Hi, do I know you?
No, you do not. But you know my words. They said that one day you would be able to fight a sea sponge. After conquering the worst animated movie ever made, you are finally ready.
You don't mean...
Put it together, boy. We're in Atlantis. You know what comes next.
But I do a G3 episode every 6 reviews. I don't want to break a pattern.
Call it episode 31. You must deal with this now.
Are you telling me to cheat?
Yes, I am.
What kind of ancient master are you?
I'm not. I'm a crazy old man who drank some laundry detergent and broke into your house thinking he's Chop Chop Master Onion. Now tell me, what did the detractors say about Magical Mystery Cure?
They said that the musical numbers were terrible, they didn't have a right to surprise us on the musical element, the plot was nonsense, and it was an insult to the adult fanbase.
Show them what that looks like. Show them the truth. It must be done.
His next review was Atlantis Square Pantis, which is actually a really clever use of continuity on Enter's part. However, the thing I want you to notice is the fact that we, the audience, were not supposed to just take the fact that all of a sudden there's an old man character in Enter's reviews now on its own. Enter actually gave the character some sort of introduction, compared to this robot character who just appears out of nowhere.
This kind of PSA is pretty common, I'd say, as climate change becomes a more hotly contested political football. We don't get these kind of things as much as we did in the 90s, but every show needs to have an Earth Day special, whether it be SpongeBob or The Loud House. So, the greenhouse from the Loud House kind of blows.
Okay, so this might be weird for me to interject, but whenever Mr. Enter reviews a new thing, especially considering that it's supposed to be his job, we're going to give out a synopsis for each of the episodes/PSA, starting off with the greenhouse. During class in the greenhouse, Mrs. Johnson was taking part in an eco-friendly polar bear challenge to find ways to reduce their carbon footprint. But Lincoln's house had a huge footprint due to his multiple sisters. Because of that, Lincoln is doomed to be a social outcast because they're going to lose. In order to solve the issue, Lincoln convinced his sisters to go green by reducing their carbon footprint, such as recycling the baby's diapers for electricity, or writing a letter instead of communicating via electronics. Their house goes green, but it fails because Lincoln's friends came over and participated in an online Swords and Cyborgs tournament, one of which is his best friend, Clyde, because he couldn't power on due to his solar house not being able to generate electricity due to the sun being covered up. Their sisters saw that Lincoln was a hypocrite and got their stuff back. Lincoln learned that he should have gone green for the sake of it instead of his own selfish desires, and decided to power the house manually via a bicycle. They won the polar bear challenge, but Lincoln became a temporary social outcast due to how he stinks. Again, it's going to be weird for us to do this. In fact, you guys might be wondering why we're doing this, but I have 2 major issues with Enter's reviewing style as we move along. And part of this is with having us to give out a synopsis to each of the episodes/PSAs.
I don't even know what those reasons are, and I'm his co-op partner, so I'm just as lost as the rest of you.
Like, really hard? Actually, that's a weird statement. The Greenhouse is a fascinating episode for someone who is not an environmental activist. It's bad, but it's fascinatingly bad because of how incompetent it is. You see, The Greenhouse from the Loud House showcases exactly why every single environmental PSA ever made has been completely useless in doing anything. I'm absolutely serious on this one. You want to know why environmental messages don't work? This is the episode why.
You know, I'm starting to think Enter doesn't like the environmental message of this episode. Call it a hunch.
I'm sorry, what does Enter not like again?
The environmental message. I forgive you for not picking that up. He's being really subtle.
Ah. Wait. I forgot again.
Okay, so you know how this episode has an environmental message?
No, I'm saying that I have a memory of a goldfish. Keep up, please.
For starters, you ever watch an environmental PSA that shits on renewable energy? And I mean, the episode has a good point here. It's not up to the kids whether their house is solar powered or powered by fossil fuels. That's their parents doing, which is kind of a problem for the plot, you know.
I mean, even though that isn't what the main message of the episode is about. The main episode's topic is about finding ways to reduce their carbon footprint overall. You know, things such as not using a lot of electricity, such as sending out physical letters, or using recyclable bottles to play instruments on. Also, this is even implying that kids and only kids are just watching this, because not only are people like you and me who are animation fans watching this, to which the both of us are adults, but the kids' parents might also watch this too when it comes to supervising their kids and or if they want to engage in that activity with them. U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics provided an article made by Rachel Kranz-Kent called Television: Capturing America's Attention at Prime Time and Beyond, and states that of those who are 15 years and up who have watched television, 57.2% are with family and 20.2% are with children. Unfortunately, they don't state the definition of family, so while the latter is what they're probably talking about, I've gone with both just to be safe. So really, this isn't geared just towards children in terms of the message of the episode. It's also directed to the parents, too.
For that matter, Enter says that this episode shows a flaw with renewable energy because Lincoln's parents don't use it. So renewable energy is bad because people don't use renewable energy. How is that a flaw exactly? Lastly, Enter quite literally just said that the main conflict of the episode is a problem with the plot. I don't even know how to respond to that.
You ever get an assignment at school where your success or failure depends entirely on other people, like your parents and your siblings and the size of your family?
It's a challenge, not an assignment. The students won't get a lower grade if they don't succeed.
As shitty as my school was, I don't think I ever had that situation like Lincoln does in this episode. But, I mean, it's accurate because a single person can't really do much for or against the environment, especially if they're not rich. I love it, really, but yes, in this battle between fossil fuels and renewables, they both have issues and downsides. I don't know why this is contentious, why these are seen as a magic bullet, but both solar and wind power have issues. Neither of them are effective enough to meet current power demands with our current technology, and each of them actually do have environmental issues. Wind power requires clear-cutting forests and chops up birds like nothing else.
10 times as many birds die entangled with electrical cords than die through being chopped up by wind turbines.
To further back up the point, according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as of 2017, wind turbines kills off more than 230,000 birds, but yet there are other deadly causes to birds that are considered to be man-made. Things like collisions to both building glasses and vehicles, and birds can also be poisoned from man-made objects, are actually a lot higher than wind turbines. All of these are considered to be in the millions. Not only that, but they've either resolved or greatly reduced the deaths through technology development or by properly siting wind plants. Apparently one of those is just by painting the fins black. And they're planning on developing another technology development with bats. Also, they can be placed on existing farms and ranches where they can greatly benefit the economy in rural areas, considering that they only have a small fraction of land mass. Also, there's wind turbines out in the ocean too, even though that they're more expensive to make, so there's that, I guess? Like, if we're assuming that cutting forests down is true, then that's a big problem, especially when it comes towards places like being on top of a mountain. But there's other areas where wind turbines can be placed that don't have the trees be chopped down. Not only that, but if you also consider the ecological damage and pollutants via fossil fuels, whether it be from extracting or burning them, this is admittedly negligible.
Solar panels actually produce a ton of waste in and of themselves, and they must be replaced every 5 years. And we don't have a place to really store retired solar panels.
If only we had some kind of plot of land which we could, let me think, fill with trash. Sadly, it seems like the world has yet to come up with this crazy invention. Yes, I know landfills aren't the most environmentally friendly approach, but Enter said we didn't have anywhere to store retired solar panels, which is just wrong. Had he said we didn't have a good place to put retired solar panels, then that would be more accurate.
So what Enter's saying here is mostly true. One of the parts that isn't true is that there are indeed some solar panels that do end up being recycled, but it should be noted that only 10% of it is indeed recycled. This is because there's only one state via the state law in Washington that does indeed make people recycle their solar panels as of August of 2020. But other than that, the US has no solar recycling mandates at all. Another part that isn't true is when Enter states that the average lifespan of a solar panel is about 5 years, because the source I got it from says that it can last for about 25 years.
Yeah, funny you mentioned that. When I looked it up, it said it was between 25 and 30 years. Hell, another article I found even says they don't stop producing energy after that point, they simply produce less of it. Yet another source I could find says they could last up to 50. I should note, these were among the first results I got from various Google searches while trying to find where Enter got this idea.
So, I am more confused with how and why Enter got that 5 years thing. Wonderful. Anyways, well, although I can make this interjection a lot longer by strengthening Enter's point, because yes, most of this I do agree with Enter here, what I would actually recommend that you guys do is read up a Grist article made by Maddie Stone called Solar Panels Are Starting to Die. What would we do with the megatons of toxic trash? Trust me, it goes into a lot more detail about how solar panels gets recycled and why we don't really recycle them to begin with. Which, fun fact, also helps Ephraim's landfill point, as it typically costs less than $1 to dump a solar panel in a solid waste landfill, rather than a typical e-waste facility, which oftentimes equal the cost to recycle. That being said, however, I really don't like the overall delivery of the point that you've made here. What I'm saying is that you do realize that if there's an issue that needs to be addressed, then you don't throw up your hands and say, I give up. This is not renewable energy that we should hugely rely on. You actually need to find a solution and produce that solution when you can. You are giving me this huge I give up mentality to the point where I honestly think that if you didn't think like that, then you would have a better understanding about why we need solar energy. I know that it might take a while for us to find a solution, but we don't find a solution if you assume that we can't find one to begin with. Even if it takes us more than 100 years from now, to which I do agree that we should find one now, but bear with me with this exaggeration. Us finding one within the future is better than us not doing anything about it at all.
But don't you see 8,363? Because the solutions now aren't perfect, we should keep doing things that are even worse.
And of course, the most common criticism brought up, which is what the episode goes with, is that sometimes the wind doesn't blow and the sun don't shine.
John, if the sun actually stopped shining, you'd fucking die within a couple of days at most, as would all life on Earth.
While batteries exist, a constant flow of power is required in a developed nation. Because without the constant flow of electricity, people will die, as would happen during the cold snap that hit Texas last winter. The Texas thing became a flashpoint in the climate change debate. Both fossil fuels and windmills froze, and both sides are claiming that the other side is stupid. The actual issue is that Texas failed to winterize, because, and hear me out on this, when environmentalists claim that the planet is warming at an unprecedented rate due to fossil fuels, the last thing that anyone thinks to do is make sure that windmills in the desert that is Texas, which is a primary exporter of oil, can withstand heavy snowfall.
Ah, the well-known scientific fact that snow cannot fall in places where there is oil. What? Okay, to be fair, maybe John just means that blizzards are rare in Texas. And this is true if you ignore the fact that Texas suffered massive blizzards in both 2015 and 2017. I also want to point out John's story here, that because environmentalists said the world was going to warm at an unprecedented rate, Republicans in Texas, who deny the claims environmentalists make, therefore decided not to winterize. It doesn't make any sense. Remember, Texas was the state George W. Bush was governor of, and as governor, he caused it to have the worst air quality of any state. A full history of Bush's environmental record as governor of Texas can be found in Molly Ivins and Lou DeBose's book, Shrub, The Short But Happy Political Life of George W. Bush, if you are curious. Texas has been controlled by Republicans almost exclusively since the mid-90s or so, with the election of George W. Bush to the presidency in 2000, turning it into the massive Republican stronghold we know it to be today. One of the Republicans who has ran the state since then has been Rick Perry, who was George W. Bush's lieutenant governor and the governor of Texas from George W. Bush resigning from the office so he could be president in 2000 until Greg Abbott's inauguration in early 2015. Rick Perry is also the man who very famously campaigned on the promise to abolish the Department of Energy when he ran for president in 2012. He also sometimes forgot what the Department of Energy was.
And I will tell you, it's 3 agencies of government when I get there that are gone. Commerce, education, and the, what's the third one there? Let's see.
You need 5.
Oh, 5, okay. So commerce, education, and the
EPA?
EPA, there you go. No, okay.
Let's stop deposition.
Seriously? Is EPA the one you were talking about? Or?
No, sir. No, sir. We were talking about the agencies of government. EPA needs to be rebuilt. There's no doubt about that.
But you can't name the third one?
The third agency of government, yeah. I would do away with the education, the commerce, and let's see. I can't. The third one I can't. Sorry.
And yes, that is the same Rick Perry who was later Donald Trump's Secretary of Energy.
Also, ignoring that Texas has their own power grid, and like you're treating the Texas outage affecting the rest of the country, which it didn't, your explanation for why Texas failed to winterize is completely wrong. It has nothing to do with Texas being a desert, which is ludicrous in its own right because the vast majority of Texas is plains near the coast and semi-arid farther out. It's mainly because more than a few Texas politicians have their hands in the fossil fuel industry, and therefore, those are their more primary concerns. Heck, why do you think that in 2019, less than 28% of electricity was made by fossil fuels, where less than 1/3 of it is made by renewable energy?
John is right that Texas is a primary exporter of oil. However, what he fails to realize is that means the oil industry has a lot of money and therefore a lot of influence over Texas politicians. I know this is an old example, but fuck, which state gave us Enron again? And they were able to operate as they did for so long because regulators simply didn't bother looking into them because they were seen as a powerful oil company and therefore were allowed to do basically whatever the hell they wanted.
Doesn't help that an ex-mayor of Colorado City, Texas, proclaimed on Facebook, "This is survival of the fittest," as many people were freezing to death. Nor does it help that Ted Cruz, a senator in Texas, decided that a family trip to Cancun was more important than helping the state that he represents, even with the fact that he states that it was a mistake for him to go. Plus, a very good chunk of people in Texas are climate change deniers. Admittedly, not a majority. About 23% of Texans are climate change deniers, but a good chunk of the state are. This also includes some of the politicians in the state. They never even had the foresight to prepare for a situation like the one they had in February of 2021, even though they were all warned 11 years ago as of writing the script that their grid was nowhere near ready for winter storm conditions. This was a prime example of why climate change denial and over-reliance on fossil fuels can have devastating consequences.
Climate change, global warming, whatever you want to call it, I do believe is real. The evidence is obvious, but it's obviously a poorly marketed and poorly named problem, and the way we talk about it is completely wrong.
Remember, weather is not the climate, but the unprecedented cold weather in Texas is proof of climate change.
People said that it was a result of climate change, not that it was proof of climate change. You've gotten this point completely backwards.
Also, there's that robot again. Hi, are you going to introduce yourself, or am I going to be wondering who you are for the rest of the video?
Science communication is a field that has been dead for decades at this point. We are in desperate need of a Bill Nye that hasn't gone fucking insane.
So, you guys, seriously, this next thing I feel is very special.
Cause my sex junk is so much more than either.
This song was nominated for an Emmy, by the way. At this point, I would like to formally nominate Genghis Khan for an Emmy, because he is just about as deserving as an Emmy as anything else the Emmys award and nominate these days.
Wait, the song itself? Hold on, that doesn't make any sense. Let me check up on that. Alright, so here's the 2017 Emmys list provided by Deadline. Now, let me find the episode in question. Here we go. Bill Nye Saves the World, The Sexual Spectrum. That's the episode title in question, I should add. Now, what are the other nominees? Amanda Knox, Anthony Bourdain, Parts Unknown, The Beatles, 8 Days a Week, The Touring Years, and 13th. Huh. Well, really weird list of nominees, but it's probably for Best Song in the Documentary. Now, what's the category? Outstanding Writing for a Non-Fiction Program. Are we not gonna include the other parts of the episode, Enter? There were actually more things about the episode than just the cringy bit that everyone seems to focus on. Bill Nye talks about the 6 chromosomes and how 1 in every 400 pregnancies have a different number of sex chromosomes, use an abacus to describe how sex, gender, attraction, aka sexual orientation, and expression are all in a spectrum, actually talks about South Korea, a place where they're more conservative, and how K-pop is changing the idea of sexual expression, with one example being one artist known as Amber, and how she's expressing more of a tomboy look, and another about how South Korean men are wearing more makeup. Had a panel of experts, which involves people like Dr. Jeffrey McCoon, that talks about the history and misconceptions of homosexuality and gender roles, then a small animation of the ice cream bit, then the cringy song, and then finally used 4 mannequins for an overview on the topic. It was possibly nominated for an Emmy because of the other bits and not just the song itself, so I kinda have no idea why you've mentioned the song and how that song itself was nominated for an Emmy. Because if the song itself was nominated for an Emmy, it would have been nominated in a different category such as the Original Music and Lyrics Award.
I don't even get what Enter's point is supposed to be. So, science communication is dead because an episode of Bill Nye Saves the World had a silly song? Okay. What is the song communicating exactly, and is it scientifically accurate? Enter goes into literally no detail. Instead, he just flashes the song on screen like a predator flashes his cock and expects us to get it. Lastly, why would you nominate Genghis Khan for an Emmy? Genghis Khan is a person, and may he rest in peace. For the record, I get the joke is supposed to be, lol, that's so bizarre and it would never happen, but it doesn't even make any sense. Wouldn't it be funnier if John said a well-known bad movie was nominated for an Emmy as opposed to an imperialist warlord from the 12th and 13th centuries?
So, the greenhouse accurately showcases what's going to happen when any country goes green. Climate change is not an entirely environmental issue. It's a diplomatic one. In the episode, Lincoln makes his house go green. So everyone else in the class trying to stay green takes advantage of Lincoln. If you don't dig for oil in your backyard, you're gonna have to ask your neighbors for some. And you're gonna have to do just about whatever they say, no matter how immoral they are, because the demand for it hasn't vanished. The problem is, with current technology, renewables aren't as reliable as fossil fuels. So when a country does decide to go green, it lowers its own productivity, hurting it on the global stage. Other countries are incentivized not to go green, as it gives them an economic boom and more relative power on the global stage. Eventually, the polluters are going to dominate the global stage by polluting.
Okay, one thing that really annoys me about this video is the fact that Enter constantly refuses to give sources or use examples to back up his point. And this is a great example as to why that is a massive issue. What makes Enter believe this? Fuck if I know, but he does. According to John, if China went green but Ethiopia got rid of all its regulations, Ethiopia would become an economic superpower overnight, apparently. It wouldn't be such an issue if there wasn't one obvious counterexample Enter hasn't addressed, albeit he kind of tries to later, and we'll get to that in a minute. And that's the various environmental treaties, such as the Kyoto Protocols or the Paris Climate Accords, which the vast majority of the world has signed on to. There are also the various economic issues such things would cause. For example, limiting the amount of fossil fuel in existence would lower supply and therefore raise prices, making it less affordable for the average person and therefore incentivizing a shift to renewable energy.
Oh, please. You say that he doesn't have any sources, but I have a theory that he probably doesn't want us to see it.
For those at home, my co-op partner is currently staring at me very menacingly. I'm scared.
Please, I ain't going to do anything to you. Yet.
I need an adult.
But I am an adult.
Oh, well, then I need a second adult, I guess.
Things like the Paris Accord only work if everybody plays together. In the current state of global affairs, everyone is not going to play together.
And yet, nearly every country in the world signed on to it. Also, this idea that the Paris Climate Accords wouldn't work just doesn't make any sense when you actually know what the Paris Climate Accords were. Each country involved with the climate accords sets forward their own goal, which they can meet however they want. Many countries just submitted what they were going to do anyway. Hell, a number of countries submitted that they were going to reduce their carbon footprints by less than they were going to do so anyway. Plus, there was no actual penalty for a country not following through with its end of the bargain. So tell me, John, what would the Paris Climate Accords not working look like exactly? And how would it be different from it working? To get more specific, China promised that it would reach peak emissions in 2030, at which point it would start reducing. Which, by the way, was when it was going to hit peak emissions anyway. I guess if Enter's right and the Paris Climate Accord fails, they'll intentionally wait longer to hit peak emissions. I guess because the world's largest nation and an economic superpower still needs to remain a superpower via polluting. Pakistan promised that it would at some point hit its peak and then start reducing emissions. If Enter is right and the Paris Climate Accords were a failure, then Pakistan is going to keep increasing its emissions for all of eternity. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the Paris Climate Accords, if you couldn't tell, although that's primarily because I disagree with what they fundamentally are. John was right when he said that climate change is a political issue, and the Paris Climate Accords were a political agreement at the end of the day. As such, if we want to discuss John's statement that the Paris Climate Accords wouldn't work, we need to discuss what they are. If the goal was environmental in nature, then they were a failure. But that's not because the countries didn't play together, that was primarily because it was designed in such a cartoonishly diplomatic way that any chance of actual change was dead on arrival. It's almost like it was made by the Obama administration or something. However, if the end goal was political, I would at least argue the success has been mixed, considering it did put climate change front and center in our political discourse for quite some time afterwards.
When conservatives point to China and India, they aren't just whinging. By ignoring their impact, it incentivizes them to keep polluting, making them more powerful, making pollution more powerful.
Ignoring them? The Trans-Pacific Partnership was specifically designed to counter China when it came to things like human rights and, yes, the environment and carbon emissions. Don't get me wrong, the Trans-Pacific Partnership had tons of issues and it was an overall good thing the United States didn't ratify it, but that doesn't change the fact that politicians are discussing how to deal with the environmental impact of China. Oh, also per capita, the United States produces over twice as many carbon emissions as China does, just so you all know.
So this episode that says you should go green brings up another really good point against going green. Environmentalism is gross. Like, really gross. If you want an example, the pandemic of 2020 killed a lot of virtues, but I think that environmentalism was one of their first sacrifices. Wear a mask, make sure you don't use the same one twice in a row. Either dispose it, or waste a shit ton of water in between each use if you want to do this properly and safely.
I mean, never mind that we also have reusable mask, Enter.
To be fair, he did mention those before dismissing them because washing them uses, quote, a shit ton of water. How much water? I'm not sure, but it's a shit ton.
Throughout 2020, 1.5 billion masks have fallen into the ocean, and they tend to end up scattered across the ground as well. The overcleaning and the aerosols involved in sanitizing everything is bound to jack up the ecosystem.
I like how we went from one person not being able to have a massive impact on the environment to you personally wearing a mask and using soap is going to literally end the world. Also, Enter had it right the first time because roughly half of all CO2 emissions come from top corporations and billionaires. In fact, the entire idea of a personal carbon footprint was thought up by BP Oil.
Even ignoring 2020 specifically, you shower probably every single day, which is more than you need to, scientifically speaking, and it wastes water. You also waste clean, fresh water every single time you flush the toilet. Like, every single day, you waste enough water for an entire family to survive on for a week. If climate change scientists and activists are right, flushing the toilet might be the sin that future generations try to erase us for when the water wars start. No, I'm not exaggerating.
Remember, those environmentalists are doing nothing but panicking. Also, we're literally going to have wars over water in the future. You know, even though billions of people are water insecure right now, and we don't have the Great World Water Wars trademark, if you can be dismissive, then so can I.
But you want to flush the toilet every single time you use it, never reuse dirty clothes, shower every single day, because it's all about feeling good.
Dana, did you see some shirts here in the floor bed area?
Yeah, I put them in the hamper.
I have a hamper?
It's in the back.
Will you tell me next time you're going to do that, though, please?
Well, I thought they were dirty.
I have more than 2 grades of laundry, okay? There's not just clean and dirty. There are many subtle levels, okay?
One struggle!
In the episode, Lincoln and the class aren't interested in making an environmental change for the better. They're doing it for the selfish reasons of naming a polar bear. In this environmental episode, everyone only does environmentalism for their own selfish ends, to the point they take advantage of other people so they can claim to be environmentally friendly.
This is true, but there's also the fact that Lincoln states near the end that we should be going green for the sake of it instead of our own selfish desires. You know, the actual moral/lesson that you've decided to not include, and instead talks about how environmentalists are stinky, or how others would take advantage of you.
And also, everyone is held up to the same standard, despite vastly different sizes of population. Which, once again, is accurate. Environmental regulations tend to hurt bigger families, which are usually poorer families because rich people tend to have fewer kids for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to go into right now.
I love how he shows a picture of a family from, I'm pretty sure that's India, to make his point, even though the average Indian family only emits half a ton of CO2 per year. Hell, despite what Enter would have you believe, the rich are more responsible for CO2 emissions than the poor are. Yes, I know I keep bringing that up, but in my defense, it is a very important point. Even then, the average Indian is still producing less than the global average of 4 tons a year, and especially less than the 16 tons a year the average citizen of the United States produces.
In fact, the main reason why India is producing a lot of CO2 emissions, even though the average person only emits just under 2 parts per million, is because the country is one of the most populated countries in the world. Over 1.3 billion as of 2016, as a matter of fact. It is therefore why India is considered to be ranked 3rd in 2016 of the countries who emit the most CO2 emissions.
Now, if this is not a family from India and it's instead just the family in some random third world African country that hasn't yet industrialized, then this point still doesn't make any sense. Because while it is true that carbon emissions did spike as the result of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, that doesn't tell the full story. The graph on your screen right now is from Our World in Data, and it tracks carbon emissions ever since 1750. Although there was a spike during both the US and China's industrial eras, it should be noted that the carbon emissions continued to grow after that point for a variety of reasons. In the US, it was primarily due to a hostility towards both renewable energy and nuclear power, put together with the United States' status as an economic superpower in the post-World War II era, resulting in more growth primarily because it existed for longer. The nations of countries like Japan, the United Kingdom, and Germany had to all rebuild after World War II because they were massively damaged. You can't really create factories or have office buildings where people work when every single piece of your infrastructure was bombed by either the Nazis or the Allies. The US was mostly absolved from this, and as such, they were able to essentially just pick up where they left off after the war was over. And this was before anyone had even heard of the concept of a carbon footprint, so nobody even thought that maybe all these fossil fuels were harmful for the environment. By the time we did start learning more, powerful people had a vested interest in us not learning more, and hid both information about this and environmentally friendly alternatives. And in China, it's for a variety of complex reasons, basically coming down to neoliberal economic reform, especially after we started opening up trade with them in the 90s, causing their leading communist party to basically turn the entire country into a brutally efficient perpetual economic growth machine. This, combined with the fact that China has the largest population of any country on Earth, results in them having the most CO2 emissions. It's not industrialization necessarily, it's how those in power have reacted to it.
And poorer families are disproportionately minority families. And yeah, that tends to be how eco resolutions go. They treat every single situation exactly the same, even if it's unfeasible for some people to actually meet these resolutions. And they really fuck over the working class and the poor, which ended up sparking the Yellow Vest protests in France.
John, turn your music down. We can't hear you.
Well, an interesting fact about it, Enter did state within the description saying, and I quote, "Audio mixing was done by me, and I know there were issues with it in a couple of places."
Huh, I didn't realize that was an excuse.
It's like an episode on why environmentalism is a stupid fool's errand. But, I mean, climate change activists themselves have kind of convinced me of that. And what I'm about to say assumes that everything is honest and every single one of these studies is above board, where everything they say is completely 100% honest and truthful. The biggest proponents of climate change are climate change activists. They've basically been arguing unless we radically change how society is structured, we've got 12 years before the end of the world. Taking a step back from the panic, it's 12 years until climate change becomes irreversible or very much damaging. Either way, it doesn't really change how futile everything is. So, they have thoroughly convinced me, personally, that the only thing we could do in our fight against climate change is remove all funding to climate change research, environmental protection, and allocate it to surviving the oncoming changes. Because there's no way you're doing something that basically requires world peace to stop, and fundamentally changing the nature of the human race in a zodiac cycle.
Take that, the Clean Air Act of 1970! We cannot fundamentally change human nature in a dozen years! Also, even if what John says is true, wouldn't it make more sense to delay it so we can at least be more prepared when it happens?
Up! That's spoiler territory. He mentions this again later on in the review.
You mean there's more of this?
Wait. I think we forgot that this is a review. Okay, yeah, I should probably say, Enter loves to go on long-winded tangents throughout the review about something that he wants to rant about politically instead of trying to talk about the episode.
I should note, coming from someone who is a political writer and who can ramble about these topics all the time, just look at this commentary if you don't believe me, I'm not against Enter going on these side tangents, assuming he can tie them back to what he's talking about. This is where Enter honestly drops the ball. He goes on and on about things that have basically nothing to do with the episode he's reviewing outside of the fact that they're vaguely related to the topic at hand. This isn't even like what John did in his Let's Not Be Skeletons review, where he gave his opinion on gun control so everyone knew his own biases. That would be fine. But instead, he's trying to debunk these vague activists and argues things that, best as I can tell, nobody argues against.
I should also note that this actually isn't the worst of it, as the worst of it comes in when we talk about COVID-19 and its relations to mask. Just thought that I should prep you guys.
John, do you need to start a news podcast or something?
I probably would. I would start a podcast about why bisexuals are valid.
I did a news podcast before. it was okay.
I mean, do you want to live in the 2020 lockdowns for the rest of your life? Because some environmental-obsessed governments are wanting to replace pandemic lockdowns with environmental lockdowns.
Which ones? John, do you think people are taking Soylent Green as a blueprint or something? Because if so, well, Ceausescu was executed by a firing squad, so I don't see that as likely. That's a joke for all my understanders of socialist Romania.
Fun fact, I was going to try and look this up, until I realized I still have no fucking clue on which countries you're talking about. Or if this is some weird nightmare that you had. In fact, I don't really see this as an actual issue to begin with, truth be told. Like, I'm sorry, but part of me is suspecting that you're kind of blowing this out of proportion unless you can prove to us otherwise.
The next thing that he reviews is a song from Lil Dicky called Earth. In it, Lil Dicky talks about climate change and how we should prevent it because animal life and human life would be disrupted. It was released on April 19th, 2019, just 3 days before Earth Day, and it charted at 17 in the Billboard Top 100s. The song was also a big collaboration with over 30 artists taking part, including Justin Bieber, Ariana Grande, Snoop Dogg, Katy Perry, Ed Sheeran, and many more. It's honestly not really a good song, and that's one thing that I, MTR, and Enter can all agree on.
It's time to stop!
Wow, funny meme XD, John. You just made the whole squad laugh.
When one of the most public figures in the climate change debate is a man whose only talent is pointing out how small his manhood is, can you really be surprised that people don't want to get involved in this?
Wait, so Little Penis Man is one of the world's biggest climate change activists? I was not aware of this. Hell, I went to Small Richard's Wikipedia page just to make sure this wasn't me being out of touch, and I found one reference to him being an environmentalist, and it was because of this song.
I think if we need any activism, we need to raise awareness of people's dick sizes.
Okay, you first.
Well, I just walked into that one. I should let my boyfriend know. He'll be ashamed of me for this.
Yes, we must stop global warming to save the beaver baboons because they have huge anuses. If we lost those, it would truly be a tragedy on this planet.
You do know that species going extinct is bad, right? Like, that would actually terribly affect the ecosystems of multiple countries. Hell, just limiting this to baboons, they play a very important part in the fynbos ecosystem in South Africa, where they have lived for over 2 million years, and their extinction would greatly change how the ecosystem functions due to their essential role in plant reproduction and plant dispersal.
But don't you know? Enter's main point was that it was way too comedic, meaning that he can't take this seriously.
Also, remember, environmentalists do not care about the third world according to Enter. They just want to save a species that is incredibly important to the ecosystem of Africa. A species which Enter is more or less saying he does not care about the extinction of.
Maybe people would take these activists like DiCaprio or John Kerry or Thunberg more seriously if they practiced what they preached. You cannot, and I repeat this, you cannot be an environmental activist and travel all around the world in planes and cars and stuff. The action is entirely contradictory with the belief.
First off, and this is probably a nitpick, but John Kerry is not an activist, he's a politician. For that matter, Kerry only uses public flights that are going to take off anyway, meaning he's not actually adding any additional carbon to the atmosphere that wasn't going to be put there anyway. Thunberg also does not use private jets. Her most famous speech was the one she gave at the United Nations in New York City in 2019, and she traveled from Sweden to New York on a sailboat. Not on a jet.
It's like being a vegetarian butcher. It doesn't make sense. Especially in an age with video communications. It's like saying that you're an animal rights activist while running a dogfighting ring.
I like how he felt the need to make basically the same comparison twice in a row.
Or saying that you care about people with autism while supporting Autism Speaks. Ahem. Ahem. Ahem.
I can kinda guess towards what you're trying to go for here, but the issue is that there might be some nuances about the Autism Speaks one. In fact, there might be some other nuances with the other two examples, but I specifically want to go ahead and talk about the Autism Speaks one. Like, for example, and some clarification here, I don't like Autism Speaks either, and this is coming from someone who's autistic here, but if someone states that they want to help autistic individuals but support Autism Speaks, they probably don't know why Autism Speaks sucks to begin with. Trust me, there are people out there who don't know about the true issues of the organization. It's just that people need to be educated more about why Autism Speaks is a bad organization and why you should switch over to other alternatives such as the ASAN Foundation.
But Mr. 63MTR, if we allow room for nuance, how will we take unfunny potshots at people we don't like?
Mallet. Just mallet.
Honestly, the biggest problem with the global warming debate is that it attracts people with a god complex. Who else has enough delusions to believe that they can change nature, human or otherwise?
Especially through flushing the toilet.
Okay, my biggest gripe about this point is that you're saying that people aren't changing nature of all things, when yet there has been evidence time and time again showcasing that we are indeed changing nature. Because we're changing the phenomena of the physical world collectively, including plants, animals, the landscape, and other features and products of the Earth as opposed to humans or human creations. Considering that climate is the weather conditions prevailing in an area in general or over a long period, and weather is the state of the atmosphere at a place and time as regards heat, dryness, sunshine, wind, rain, etc., weather is considered to be a part of nature. If anything, if we're going by your wording here, we're trying to prevent the change of nature over time, not saying that we apparently can change it. In fact, hold on, let me go through the 3 things that we humans are changing in nature with the help of fossil fuels. With precipitation, a lack of rain and snow over an extended period of time will create droughts, and they'll become longer and more extreme over time, with the Southwest like California at a severe risk. That means that there's less water for drinking, watering crops, making electricity at hydroelectric dams, and other uses. Due to that, wildfires are occurring more, as well as being able to start more easily, spread faster, and burn longer. I mean, heck, if you heard about California, they used to have a fire season, but now they don't anymore. Fires are popping up here and there all year now. At the same time, places such as the northeastern states are actually getting more precipitation, and thus in turn will create flooding if the precip gets too heavy. This is because this extra precipitation is actually not spreading easily around the globe, and some places might actually get less precipitation than they used to get, like Hawaii or California for example. With temperature, we need to discuss carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. To start off, let's take a look at the atmosphere and what it's made of. 78% of it is made of nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and the rest, mostly argon, being the 1%.
1% represent.
Part of that 1% is carbon dioxide. Before the Industrial Revolution, the global average of CO2 levels was 280 ppm, or parts per million. However, when fossil fuels such as oil and coal were in place, they slowly rose to today's measurements, being somewhere greater than 415 ppm, which has never crossed that level in a millennia. In fact, it never crossed a level of little over 300 until 1950. The important role that carbon dioxide plays in the atmosphere is that it traps heat, because without it, our planet would actually be cold, and we humans wouldn't live without it. The heat from the sun will travel to the Earth, and it will bounce back out into space. CO2's job is to make sure that the heat inside is trapped in. Think of it as walking into a greenhouse during a summer day and noticing that it's incredibly hot. That's what carbon dioxide is, essentially. The issue, however, is that there's actually more CO2 in the atmosphere now, which in turn traps more heat in the atmosphere. This in turn will melt the ice caps on Earth, making the sea level rise each and every year, thus apparently making Aquaman become the best underwater realtor.
By the way, we've known that carbon dioxide affects the climate since a study by Swedish chemist Savit Arhinis that was released in 1895. Just a little fun fact for you all.
As for winds, a paper published by Jordan Abel and Grisla Winkler on January the 6th, 2021, from Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory found a new way of tracking wind patterns. By looking at the sediments that were drilled at the bottom of the ocean, dust and cores collected by the research vessel helped them reconstruct wind patterns that occurred 3 to 5 million years ago. What they found was that the westerlies are actually moving poleward. Though they don't know why this is the case, though this might be due to a shift between certain natural climate cycles, nor whether or not it will confirm if it will rain more or less, it does confirm that the wind and precipitation patterns will change with climate change. If you still don't believe that we're changing nature due to this, then I'm sorry, but I'm honestly at a loss for words.
Speaking of complexes, anything else you got to say, little Dickie? I don't... Excuse me, what? Yeah, Germany. I know you had the whole Nazi thing, but we're cool now, so let's save the planet.
Okay, am I the only one who finds it odd that Enter focuses on the line about Germany, which, by the way, forgiving them implies that they acknowledge the bad actions Germany has done in the past, but doesn't say anything about them saying they love China and India, both of whom are committing genocide right now?
What the fuck? What the fuck even is this? Yeah, I don't give a shit what the message is. I'm not gonna listen to anyone who drops a line like that. Especially since Germany hasn't exactly been the best in the fight against climate change themselves. Following the Fukushima nuclear disaster, Germany started reducing its nuclear power plants and opening up more wind farms. These wind farms couldn't meet energy demand and they had to start burning more fossil fuels, raising the country's carbon footprint. Because nuclear energy is literally the only way we will ever phase out fossil fuels, and environmentalists need to stop protesting it if they don't want to be hypocrites. Yes, nuclear energy has problems. It's either fossil fuels or nuclear, your choice.
Oh, that's lovely. I love the smell of false dichotomy in the morning. If there's one major problem with your point here, it's the overall fact that you think that just because wind and solar energies are not the best solution, that we shouldn't use it, or at the very least that we shouldn't fully replace them to the fullest capacity. You have to understand that we need wind and solar on top of other renewable energies in order to slowly phase out fossil fuels. The two other renewable energies that you've completely forgot to mention is with both geothermal and hydropower. If all of these 5 are combined, if you want to include nuclear into the mix, then it'll help out with replacing fossil fuels altogether. Your argument here is implying that we, those who think climate change is real and that we need to use renewable energy, should replace fossil fuels with only wind and solar when you're missing the big picture here. This is probably why Germany's wind power only didn't work, because they only focused on one thing when they should have tried to invest in other renewable energies too. And yes, there are negatives about all of these renewable energies, whether it disrupts the ecosystem/environment, the amount of power it produces, etc. But you have to understand that all of the renewable energies positives outweigh the negatives, especially when comparing this to the negatives towards fossil fuels. Honestly, I could go on and on about this subject, but after watching this commentary, I would recommend that you guys check out Courts Get Sacked, in a nutshells, How Many People Did Nuclear Energy Kill, Nuclear Death Toll, and Simon Clark's video on how to beat climate change, because it further helps my overall point about how to beat climate change, as well as to further my point on the death toll on fossil fuels compared to nuclear and other renewable resources.
Anyway, we've been covering this video for almost an hour, and we're about a quarter of the way through, slightly more than a quarter, I'd say. So what I'm going to do is, for the first time, I'm cutting this commentary into multiple parts. Not just because, at our current rate, it's going to take about 3 hours to cover the entire video, but because we have a lot more to say, since the video only gets worse as it continues. But until then, good night and good luck. This is part 2 of a commentary I'm doing with 8363 MTR on Mr. Enter's video on animated PSAs. If you have not seen part 1 yet, I would recommend doing so before continuing on with this video, link in the description.
What's next? I'm done with this.
Wait, wasn't that robot going to introduce all the topics? What happened to him exactly?
Speaking of things that should have stayed in the 90s, the Animaniacs had a reboot. A lot of people really seem to like it. Then there are others, the people who notice that Dot is actually in the show. Not to, mansplain, but when the theme song says no mansplaining, you can't expect that to not rub people the wrong way. It's alienating, which is the last thing that you want to do in a theme song.
Well, wait a minute, how alienating is the show? Because the point of a theme song is to introduce new viewers to what they're about to watch. So if the show is alienating, an alienating theme song would actually make sense.
Look, Dot was always a feminist character. People who say she wasn't never watched the original. But in the reboot, they did take her in a lot more of an abrasive direction.
Slight nitpick to your editor, Coda here, but I absolutely love that you used that picture of Dot when Mr. Enter was explaining about how over the top of Dot being a feminist is, when the actual part of the episode is really more towards an exaggerated thing about giving cartoon characters the right to vote instead. Like, yeah, the first part was about women's right to vote, but it actually ended up having more of a cartoony and over-the-top plot instead.
It's kind of the difference between third wave feminism and fourth wave, honestly.
The fuck? When did the fourth wave start? The only thing I can think of is that TERF website, Fourth Wave Now. Wait, Enter, are you saying Dot is a TERF?
That's it! I'm canceling Dot on Twitter!
Someone call the BBC.
To put it short, in this version of Animaniacs, Dot is the character who will fight against gendered language while telling you to stop mansplaining, manterrupting, and having a mantrum.
Oh, hi there, Big Rat! How are you doing on this fiend in D&D? Question, did you get any royalties out of these anti-feminists?
Wait a minute, that was a Freedom Tunes cartoon from 2015. John, is that where you get your impression of modern feminism? Because that's quite literally the only time I've ever seen somebody do this.
What I'm trying to say is that the modern Animaniacs really wears its politics on its sleeve, and it doesn't do it any favors. Once again, Animaniacs has always been political. It's even been abrasive at times. What it hasn't always been is alienating. And the Animaniacs reboot finds itself in a time period when political tensions are worse than they've been in at least half a fucking century.
You do know that most of the political divisions we see today can be traced back to the 90s, right? Hardline Republicans like Pat Buchanan, Newt Gingrich, and Grover Norquist cannibalizing the first George Bush over tax hikes, although, to be fair, that was also a bit of a trap that George Bush set himself up for, considering he promised in his 1988 RNC speech to not raise taxes. Although he primarily said that in order to appeal to Reagan purists who still didn't quite forgive him for calling supply-side economics voodoo economics during his 1980 presidential campaign, despite the fact he had been Reagan's vice president for 8 years at that point. Then when Clinton became president in 1992, although he took office in 1993, but you guys know what I mean, Republicans quickly unified against him. Newt Gingrich created GoPac, which was specifically designed to help Republicans win Congress through negativity. They also promoted various forms of divisive media. This was the decade where Rush Limbaugh became a national name and Fox News began, remember? And I could go on and on and on, but I'm just going to be blunt with you, John. This did not happen overnight, and Animaniacs was there when it began. So, to put it another way, why is it appropriate for them to act like it then, but it's not appropriate for them to act like it now? If anything, it would likely be less appropriate for them to act like it back then, because by that point, the problem hadn't started yet, and you could argue that they helped create it. Now, it's already here, so what's a cartoon going to do?
Shows like this are bordering on irresponsible. I don't know if you've noticed, but we've had political riots and people trying to take over buildings to meet political ends.
Yeah, and the 90s had Timothy McVeigh filling a Ryder truck full of explosives and crashing into a building as a form of political terrorism he took from the white supremacist novel The Turner Diaries after being inspired by a combination of the incredibly popular militia movement and, to be fair, not all that unreasonable outrage over how the ATF handled the Waco siege. Seriously, coming from someone who wrote an entire book about the event the picture John shows is from, the only conclusion a reasonable person could come to is it was primarily caused via the normalization of right-wing political terrorism that occurred over multiple decades. There's no back in my day here, John. I'm sorry, there just isn't.
Also, I thought that Trump was the one who told his supporters to march to the Capitol and create an insurrection. In fact, I thought that Trump made things more divisive due to how he talked negatively about the left, especially on Twitter, such as how the Black Lives Matter protesters are thugs, thus having some of the people on the right to complain about how the people on the left are snowflakes. Why the hell are you making it out like political cartoons such as the Animaniacs are the biggest issues on the planet, when shows like this shouldn't really be the main problems of our overall political climate due to people getting upset over it?
Buy my book, The Definition of Sedition.
You freaking shill.
Speaking of divisive bullshit, we gotta talk about gun control. Again. Oh no, I'm sorry. We have to talk about bun control. that is no, really. Excuse me for a minute. I must really process how intensely clever that pun was. You must be some kind of comedic genius to come up with that kind of intricate wordplay. No, seriously, Chaka Conroy is blushing at you masterfully changing the letter G to the letter B. What other kind of genius could think of something like that?
You know, I'm starting to think Enter doesn't like that pun. Seriously, I think John's opinion on that wordplay was not positive. What I can conclude from what the person I'm commentating on said is that he dislikes the thing he just discussed. What I'm saying is John needs to learn how to get to the fucking point.
Oh, and considering that this is the next thing that he reviews, let's do a quick synopsis. Bun Control was one of the 3 shorts in episode 4 of the Animaniacs reboot. In it, a farmer named Dwayne Lapstool arrives at the water tower selling bunnies. He tries to sell the bunnies to the Warner Brothers, to which Wacko and Dot love them and bought 2. The bunnies were soon multiplied the next day, and they tried to return it to Dwayne, but Dwayne refuses. CEO Nora Rita Norita also refuses to solve the problem, saying that she does want to keep the bunnies in the studio. This then got the Warner Brothers and Warner's sister angry after the water tower exploded, filled with bunnies, and had an anime action scene. Dwayne wins the battle, but not the war, as Wacko calls the dingoes for help. The dingoes takes all of the bunnies and sell them to people, with Dwayne being bagged up and put in a truck. And in the end of the episode, one of the dingoes commented that this episode is about gun control. And for those of you who don't know, Dwayne is actually a parody of Wayne LaPierre, a guns rights activist and the executive vice president of the NRA.
The satire of this episode, if you could call it that,
the only thing biting here is the satire.
That's what they call it, doesn't work because the scenario doesn't work in context.
Studies show that owners of multiple buns feel safer from the threat of other owners of multiple buns.
Look, skeleton remotes I could kinda get. You shoot them at someone and something permanent happens. It didn't really have a negative effect in the long run, but it was something permanent, I will give them that. A bunny, like a rabbit, unless you're a farmer or Elmer Fudd, isn't actually a threat to anyone.
You clearly have not seen Night of the Lepus. Or Watership Down, that also works.
In a situation like this, you can't just preach to the choir. You have to be on your A game. You need to speak to the people who don't agree with you. And they're gonna point out this stupid writing right up front. And gun control is a very divisive issue. Actually, that's kind of getting to be less true. One of the odd little quirks of 2020, the year that this came out, it was a banger year for gun sales in the United States. Roughly 8.5 million people bought their first gun in 2020. And get this, mostly in liberal areas. You know, the people in this country that support gun control. Or used to, I guess.
And it's later, because I've actually found Enter's source. So, because Enter didn't link any of his sources at all, I've actually had to find the source that he presented, even with me being dumb and not looking at the bottom right corner of that graph here. Nevertheless, I did find the article that you're referring to. The article is made by Rashawn Ray and Rebecca Shankman, and the article is entitled How COVID-19 is Changing the Gun Debate, published on June the 17th, 2020. While it is true that liberal states are seeing an increase in gun permit applications from February to April, I've decided to read up on the article if there's anything that you might be missing. And lo and behold, There was. Quoting from the article, from February to March 2020, using data from ammo.com, ammunition purchases in states that voted for Democrat Hillary Clinton in 2016 were nearly double that of states that voted for Republican Donald Trump. However, much of the ammunition purchases are concentrated in 2 states, Delaware and Vermont. Ammunition purchases in each of these 2 states were about 10 times higher than other states. When Delaware and Vermont are omitted from the analysis, Republican states have larger ammunition purchases than Democratic states.
It should be noted, by the way, that both Delaware and especially Vermont have abnormally large gun cultures for states that are typically considered to be liberal, progressive, and democratic in nature.
Additionally, it is important to note that Vermont, though voting for Hillary Clinton in 2016, had a higher conservative ideology score, 29, than liberal ideology score, 24. Delaware reports the highest percentage of residents in any state with a moderate political ideology score, 43. Nonetheless, it is unclear whether ammunition purchases are dispersed across many people in these states or whether these purchases are limited to a small number of people. Nor did the data tell us who is purchasing guns and ammunition. While some may speculate that liberals are purchasing guns, it could be a surge amongst conservatives in liberal states. Look, there could have been a surge of liberals applying for gun permit, but we don't know that. You're assuming that because it's happening in liberal states that only the liberals are applying for a gun permit, when, again, we don't know if that's the overall case here. However, if we head back to the article that I found due to Enter's graph, I can maybe get a good estimate on who's buying the guns and why they're doing it. That's because I also found out that the article was talking about the lockdown protests, where they also say that 66% of these protests were against a Democratic governor after all Democratic governors did the lockdown, whereas 69% of Republican governors enacted the shutdowns, and only 46 of these protests are in relation to those Republican governors. What Enter doesn't show you guys is the third and fourth figures of the article. That's because as gun permits and conservative ideology increases, states are less likely to protest, while the opposite effect is happening in Democratic states. Due to this, while some people may speculate that people are purchasing guns to protect their family during the first few months of the pandemic, and it could be occurring to a certain extent, these lockdown protests do paint a very big and different picture when it comes to Republicans signing up for a permit and purchasing guns. And honestly, that's my biggest issue with this source. Ignoring that the show was written back in 2018, so they have no hindsight towards what happened after 2 years later, this honestly shows to me that you haven't read the full source, because it pretty much debunks your overall point. My overall suggestion is for you to read what you've seen and double check on them just in case if the source is going to lead you to a different direction than what you're trying to argue for.
Gun control is a harder sell than it has ever been in a long time. And if you want to convince people to ban the things they literally just bought, you're going to need a damn good argument. And they do not have a good argument. This episode's brilliant solution to gun control is just do what Australia did, which is another thing that rings out like it came in 2018, but it was written in 2016. I feel like a robot for saying this, because the Australia argument is so well worn. I don't think that even gun control activists use Australia anymore.
Australia was already experiencing a decrease in gun violence before the ban, and the ban itself had no effect on the already downward trend.
Okay, I'm gonna say this, I honestly really don't like how Enter made this point, because it doesn't cover the overall nuance towards why Australia had a decrease in gun deaths. Why did the gun deaths in Australia see a decrease before the 1996 gun laws? What kind of deaths are we talking about? In fact, a typical gun controller would say to this graph, even though there were no mass shootings after the gun laws, and the fact that the 1996 gun laws actually help accelerate the downward trend, as indicated by a significant drop of more than 200 deaths from just 2 years apart.
Yeah, that's another constant issue with the video. Although Enter preaches of the importance of speaking to those who don't agree with you, which he is right to do so, he never actually really does it. He instead commonly characterizes the other side as, well, straw men, that he creates through smashing various ideas together into some super opposition. You know, instead of just arguing with real people. It's like watching someone argue with the voices inside of their head. Now, this is not either of us saying that we agree or disagree with any of the positions Enter argues for or against in this video. However, if Enter really is dedicated to arguing in a way that could convince the other side, he does a really bad job at it.
To make not only my argument even more valid, but to also do Enter's job and help strengthen his point, what I found out was that, according to the Australian version of ABC, the main reason why we saw a decrease in the graph of gun deaths in Australia was because less people were planning on killing themselves over the years. When it came down towards cause of death, assault by firearm, and homicide victims, cause of death from gunshot wound, they tend to actually fluctuate, but they haven't really gone down in the overall sense of they progress downward over the years. Because of this final point may be a stretch, but truthfully, I think he should have talked more about firearm homicides towards this point, rather than including both firearm homicides and suicides and other death-related causes by firearms when talking about this. This is because the episode Gun Control wasn't talking nor even implying anything about suicides at all.
Beep boop, libertarian programming activated. During the 2020 COVID pandemic, Australians became unable to leave their country without express permission from their government, preventing many families from becoming reunited. Something that typically only happens in totalitarian countries like North Korea, forcing them to deal with some of the strictest authoritarianism and pandemic controls in the Western world. This is likely something that would not have happened in an armed populace.
You know, even though the population of North Korea was armed until 2009. Roughly 5% of the North Korean population is also in the military in some form, meaning that 1 in every 20 citizens in North Korea is armed.
Also, wow, I get us towards where you're coming from, but just because one country is strict with its policies, that doesn't mean that it's in the same vein as being North fucking Korea. I mean, this is never mind too that you don't elaborate on how strict Australia is.
I wouldn't even be so baffled if he acted like this only happened in authoritarian countries like North Korea. No, John, travel restrictions are actually fairly common even among liberal democratic governments. For example, citizens of the US were not allowed to travel to Cuba from the 1960s until 2015. And no person who lives in a UN nation is allowed to go to Antarctica without UN permission. So, John, does this mean that everywhere besides Antarctica is literally North Korea? Fuck, requiring government permission to enter a country is not in the slightest unusual. What do you think passports are, John? So I don't see why the reverse would inherently be unusual either.
And for the final bit of stupid, and I do mean that this is the most stupid part of the episode, because of how little they understand Australia at all. The Animaniacs try to get rid of buns by introducing a predator, dingoes. I want to show you guys something. This is the cane toad. Why am I showing you the pictures of a toad? Well, Australia had this problem with beetles eating up all of their sugarcane, so they introduced a predator to get rid of them. You know, Animaniacs solution, introduce a predator to get rid of a problem. Unfortunately, cane toads had no natural predators in Australia, so the cane toads became a big problem as they devastated their ecosystem. And to add insult to injury, the toads didn't get rid of the beetles either. So in order to get rid of the gun violence problem in the United States, we must follow along the lead of Australia by introducing a predator into our ecosystem, which is known as one of the biggest mistakes in Australian history.
Enter, you do realize that they don't actually eat up the bunnies, right? I don't care that you didn't outright say it. You're implying that by saying words like predator and how that's apparently in connections to the cane toad. What actually happens in the episode was that the dingoes actually took the bunnies and sold them to people. And no, I don't care if that scene was supposed to be a metaphor here, even though I personally disagree. Your wording was shit enough to the point where you're implying that this was the case when it wasn't.
Obviously not the absolute biggest sin Australia's ever committed. How they treated the Aboriginals takes the cake on that one. But, didn't this show used to be about 3 cat dog things annoying a psychiatrist in an animation studio? Whatever happened to that?
Even though they didn't just annoy Dr. Scratch and Sniff and were just doing other random stuff such as annoying Michelangelo, or other historical figures too, and also roasted other political figures like Bill Clinton. Actually, what I really don't like about this point is that Dr. Scratch and Sniff came back in the reboot in 2 episodes, one of which is actually a non-speaking role, so we'll ignore that. His major role was actually pretending to be sick to prank on the Warner Brothers so that they can try to find a way to fix him, only then to actually turn himself sick by drinking the soda and turning his head into a blimp and crashing outside into a building. So, did Did you actually watch the reboot outside of the episode by any chance, Mr. Enter? Because if you haven't, then this is an actual shame on your end, as you clearly haven't watched the actual series as a whole. And I don't trust you claiming that you've watched a full series after when you admitted that you haven't watched the entirety of Rise of the TMNT in your Nicaragua review of the show. I'm not kidding, I seriously don't trust you anymore.
So, your favorite show is having a reunion. It's been off the air for like a decade, but they're making a comeback. Just one episode. What are they gonna do? Maybe they'll have some big kind of adventure. Ooh, maybe the characters are older now. Maybe we'll see their deeper, more adult drama. Or maybe they're just gonna tell you how to vote.
Or really just the fact that it's a PSA short that has the cast of 16 saying... Wait a minute. Actually, Enter, can you remind us about your definition of what a PSA is in the introduction of your review?
Some of the PSAs are outside of cartoons, like they made a commercial for it, and some of them are basically whole episodes. I'm going to be a little bit loose with the definition of a PSA. For instance, I consider the episode Let's Not Be Skeletons to be a PSA on gun control, even though it's another episode of OKKO, and not a PSA by the traditional definition.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm sorry, but this is false advertising, my dude. I don't even care that you've said it, or if you're fully aware of it, it's still false advertising. The thing about this is that The Greenhouse, Gun Control, and by extension, Let's Not Be Skeletons are considered to be episodes that have a political message, but they're not a PSA. I don't get why you're considering anything political as a PSA, considering that I remember those Foundations for a Better Life PSAs that talks about patience, or loyalty, or even caring. By that extension, does that mean that any episode that has the moral of caring or loyalty is considered to be a PSA? No, because it's just a moral and not a PSA. If anything, this review should have been retitled as The Wild World of Animated Propaganda, because although I wouldn't agree with you on that, at the very least the title paints a clearer picture about what you're reviewing, because we're now just getting to our first PSA here.
Speaking of which, it's time for yet another episode synopsis. Vote Dude is a PSA special/reunion minisode of 16 released on YouTube on September 12th, 2018. Because the 16s, that being Jen, Nikki, Caitlin, Jude, White, and Jonesy, are all 18 years old, they can register to vote, and Jen gets excited for it. They've talked about the US election, with White being disgusted at Trump and his ruling, and Jonesy later coming in wearing a MAGA hat, much to White's concern. White encourages the other 14s to vote, citing that millennials compose the largest voting group and thus can swing an entire election. With Caitlin, Nikki, and Jonesy disinterested in politics, Jude encourages his friends and nearby shoppers to vote, which prompts Coach Helder to dismiss millennials as special snowflakes with participation trophies, and Ron not knowing the experience of going to war, which just furthers their desire to register to vote, after Jen sarcastically says that they shouldn't register because the older generations will have more power in the election. Then later on, the nerd comes over and reminds them they're all Canadian, and then they just drop everything and focus on their own personal lives.
So, in 2018, the United States was getting into its midterm elections. You see, the way the United States works is we have a presidential election every 4 years, but there are several other elections in between. And the most significant of those is the halfway point, where we have elections for many members of Congress and senators.
Many members of Congress and senators? John, the Senate is part of Congress. I think what you might have meant is many members of the House, but that's also wrong because every member of the House is up for re-election.
And that gets to determine what kind of legislative branch that our president has to deal with. If the president is a Republican and the two houses of Congress are majority Democrat, it's unlikely that they'll be able to do much.
I should note, the last time the scenario John is describing occurred in American history was the 110th Congress. This was the Congress elected in 2006. Where massive results in favor of Democrats led to Nancy Pelosi becoming Speaker of the House and Harry Reid becoming Senate Majority Leader, despite Republican George W. Bush still being president. To give you an idea on how little the administration could do, 442 laws were passed by that Congress.
Or vice versa. Partisanship in this country is that bad. The last thing that Democrats and Republicans agreed to in the United States is going to war with Iraq, in 2003.
Wait, Wait, John, I thought you said that we lived in a uniquely divided time and that's why the Animaniacs reboot was bad or something. Now you're telling me that extreme amounts of political division have been going on for nearly 2 decades? For that matter, I thought the implication was that division was a bad thing and that's why you showed a picture of January 6th. But if unification and returning to a time where, as Mike Pence suggested during the vice presidential debates, yeah, politicians disagreed, but at the end of the day they'd go on the Lolita Express together, gave us the Iraq War, one of the biggest disasters in American history, then I'm starting to like division quite a bit.
So, you may be wondering what the American midterm elections have to do with the Canadian television series that ran in the mid-2000s. No, I got nothing.
Wait, John, are you saying the world of animated PSAs is kind of wild? Seriously, jokes like that don't work, not just because the punchline is incredibly predictable, although make no mistake, it very much is, but also because, yeah, I clicked on a video called The Wild World of Modern PSAs. I expect things to get a little weird.
Hey guys, wanna know what I just did? I just looked up how to register to vote.
And then I took the pledge to not have sex until after I got married. Same energy. Same fucking energy.
How? Are they both monotone? Is that the point? Because that just means the acting in the PSA is bad. I don't get what John's point is here.
Have you seen what he's done today?
Who?
Trump! He's repealing the gun restrictions!
I reiterate, these characters are Canadian. They are Canadian within the short. They expressly state that. And the president can't just unilaterally repeal laws. I know that that's a joke, that we eventually find out that they are Canadian, but it doesn't work as a joke. The setup actually needs to make sense in the universe in which the show takes place.
And yet, you've also stated that it played on Cartoon Network, and that you're American, when those episodes also originally aired, which meant that there's actually a US fan base for the show. Like, did you not notice that? On top of that, the YouTube channel Retro Rerun talks about how it's a PSA for Americans, as this is a PSA about voting in the midterm elections for Americans.
But # hashtag carrot key hashtag MTR. What if a Canadian decides to watch this PSA and attempts to vote in the American midterm election?
Then they're being dumb. Because they're not American. Like, sure, one could maybe argue as to why it's off, though I could argue back by saying that with America being a big powerhouse developed country, there's going to be a big impact on the relationships with other countries out there and that we should talk about it, but this is really just harmless at the end of the day.
And I mean, it's not like you couldn't make this joke make sense. The most passionate person about American politics you will ever meet is probably a Canadian. But until the punchline, it's like they literally believe that they are in another country.
Well, Tom, that's the joke!
And I know that Canada and the US look alike. Many people, even living in their respective countries, might not be able to discern a photograph between the two. But we are different countries, and we have different issues.
This is like watching Gollum make a review. He's constantly pointing out why his point doesn't make sense, only to say that it actually does work for reasons he can't explain. They think they're Americans! Yes, they do. They do. But they know that they aren't. That's the joke. Oh, but they seriously thinks it. No, they don't. That's my Gollum impression. What do you guys think?
And now he's starting a trade war with Canada. I mean, who doesn't like Canada?
I'm guessing you guys don't, since you've apparently renounced all your Canadian citizenship.
Well, Eddie, that's the joke!
Like, this short goes on and on, showing about how all the characters have changed and giving a general update on their life. It's something that would have been nice if it wasn't mired in current political bullshit. I mean, 2 years on, and this midterm is a distant memory, so it comes across as awkward and outdated. The swearing doesn't help much either. Also, they keep using the word millennial over and over again. Number one, I don't think that term even existed when the show came out.
John, the term millennial was coined in 1987.
It definitely wasn't in widespread use. But here's the, fun fact. If you turned 18 in 2018, you're not a millennial! You're a member of Generation Z, or Gen Z, whatever. No, not that Gen Z. We do not speak of that Gen Z ever. This whole thing really does feel like it's concentrated. Hello, fellow kids!
And this is the part where I now have to talk to you guys about why we're doing a synopsis for almost everything that Enter is reviewing. Or at the very least, one of the reasons. Yeah, the thing about it is that there's actually a couple of things. Like this part here, that Enter completely missed the point on some of these PSAs. If Enter would have just written down a synopsis of what was going on, then he wouldn't have left stuff out or not get stuff wrong. For example, if any of you recall my synopsis in this PSA, then you would know why they used the term millennial. It is because, and repeating my co-op partner here, millennials composes the largest voting group and thus can swing an entire election. They weren't wrong about this too. Usually millennial turnout during the midterm elections were pretty low until the 2018 midterm election. Not only that, but Coach Hadler dismissed all millennials as special snowflakes with participation trophies, and Ron telling the teens about how they haven't experienced war. I will concede that they could have reworded this properly to provide actual statistics about it, and admittedly not have this generation war going on, as well as admittedly a somewhat good point that you've brought up about how the poor wording with them being millennials in 2018, but they didn't just throw the word around. They actually had a point to them.
You doofuses know we can't vote in the US election, right? We're Canadian!
Like, here's another thing about this punchline. If you do care about American politics at all, you'll know how disrespectful this is. Since 2016, foreign election interference has become a very real concern in the United States. And it's not something that Americans would find a laughing matter. Doesn't matter if it's Russian, Chinese, Venezuelan, or Canadian, it's not funny. And it's quite tone deaf on some American citizens' actual concern.
Boy, do you just like to get offended by that, do you? No, I'm not even joking about that. This is you taking a huge reach about something that's actually not even about election interference at all. It's just 16s being complete dumbasses that they forgot that they're Canadian. And at the end of it, they actually drop what they're doing and just move on with their lives. How is this election interference?
Fucking Canadians stealing our election. Justin Trudeau is trying to make PSAs telling Americans to vote so he can steal our elections. That's just a fact. Everybody knows that.
This message is approved by Ronald Reagan.
I don't get it. I'm also ending it here. See you all in part 3. This is part 3 of a commentary I'm doing with 8363 MTR on Mr. Enter. Links to part 1 and 2 are below.
What's next, Arthur? How bad could it be?
So, what have you been up to lately?
Good fucking lord. What the hell happens to the animation? This looks like a 90s edutainment game. No, wait. The Arthur games from the 90s look better than this. Oh yeah, Arthur went to Flash animation for some reason I can't understand.
I don't know. Maybe they like money or something? Let me rephrase that. Essentially, this is because they're trying to save up some money. An average cost of each Invader Sim episode was $1.5 million, and that's roughly about the same figure for Avatar: The Last Airbender. Really low budget stuff can be as low as $350,000, and that's not counting anime, with the typical episode costing about $125,000. Well, although that I can't find the exact number for Flash animation and its cost, because the answers that I'm getting are very depending on the different studios, it's actually considered to be cheaper, because instead of spending hours of drawing and redrawing scenes, and having to purchase cells, paint, and drawing tools, you have rigs in which you can change the position of your character, which makes it quicker and cheaper that way.
It used to be hand-drawn, and it had a lot of personality that was reminiscent in the original Arthur books. Look, I know the PBS is publicly funded, but this kind of animation quality is not acceptable.
Call me crazy, but am I the only one who thinks this explanation of why the animation in the newer episodes of Arthur is lackluster? Like, sure, he talks about the original animation before the change, but he hasn't talked about exactly why the animation is bad specifically after the change. Is the movement considered to be bad? Are the designs of the characters in the background bad? Is there anything else I'm actually missing about it? You don't really elaborate your explanation except for the fact that we just kinda have to guess what you meant with the clips that you've just shown us.
Hell, I'll go one step farther than my co-op partner. Don't even give me away it's bad, just give me away it's different. Maybe it's because I didn't watch Arthur as a kid, but best as I can tell, the animation looks basically the same before and after the jump to Flash. The characters look the same, they move the same way, and it's in the same art style. Compare this to, say, the last season of The Fairly Odd Parents, which also had a sudden jump to Flash, where the art style was completely changed, as was the way the characters moved. The only difference that John cites is that the hand-drawn animation looks close to the original book, which, yeah, obviously it would, because the books were hand-drawn, because the first book was published in 1976. Also, what do you mean by reminiscent of the books? Because the designs in the books were far from homogeneous. This, for example, is how Arthur looked in the first book, Arthur's Nose. Notice how it is completely different from how Arthur looks in the TV show. This is how Arthur looked on the original cover of his second book, Arthur's Eyes. Notice how not only is it very different from the TV show, it's also very different from the cover of the first book. Here is Arthur in his sixth book, Arthur's Halloween, in 1982, where he is this weird potato brown for some reason. Here's Arthur in his seventh book, 1983's Arthur's April Fool. His design is the closest we've seen so far to the design that was used in the TV show, but his face is still too long for it to really be the same design of Arthur. Exactly when Arthur got his modern design is a little bit hard to pinpoint, but it was not until the later part of the 80s, hence why every single book I've shown you guys so far, except for the first one, had its cover redone at some point specifically to look more like the art of the PBS series, which was first the art of the later books. I should also note that the art in the television show and the art in the books, even the newer ones, do not resemble each other. The art in the books is much more dilapidated, rough, and, well, everything just blends together more than it does on the television show. This isn't abnormal by any means. I remember I had some Curious George books as a kid that also had this same difference from the television show to the book, but it is a difference. While Enter is saying that they look basically the same when, I'm sorry, they just don't.
Anyway, what's Arthur trying to teach people to do today? Is it about how stealing is wrong, or how you should tell the truth, or...
Ooh, Trey chic.
Oh good, it's a pandemic safety PSA. Well, this isn't going to shoot my career in the foot again. We're really doing this again. Do I have to?
Man, I just hate it when I don't know what I'm going to review in the middle of my review on various PSAs about current and controversial topics.
Yeah, speaking of which, I should probably talk about this PSA. The first Arthur PSA has Muffy and Francine talk about what they've been up to in a video voice chat call, where Muffy's dad shows up and notifies her to get going for a big sales event at Crosswired Motors, and Francine asks her before Muffy leaves if she's going to get a mask. Muffy says no because she believes that only sick people get sick, to which Francine lectures her about why you do need to wear a mask. After much convincing, Muffy asks her dad to bring a mask over, and she loves the pink one. Which is the part where things go downhill for Enter here. No, I'm generally not joking. You might want to grab a bottle and take a shot or two towards the start of him making a tangent about mask.
Like, people know what I think on this, and they don't like what I think about this.
If no one ever gave an unpopular opinion, where would your species be as a whole? If you personally suddenly stopped talking about this issue just because you didn't get a response of sunshine and rainbows, what would it say about you and what you truly believe in? If you believe that you are right, it is a duty to continue to speak up, no matter what the consequences are. You must remember that this is who you are. This is a feature, not a bug of who you are. And it is an important feature. The most important feature.
Okay, so John spends the next couple of minutes having a back and forth with this robot over if he should do this. It's not even meaningful like it was when he did this in his reviews of things like Mega Babies or The Problem Solvers, in large part because it doesn't really build to anything. In Mega Babies, it was about keeping John going when he thought the episode was too much to handle.
I can't do it. I can't continue. Oh, this is just too awful. Oh, it's you. If you cannot do it, then who can? Why don't you? You've seen the puke, the drool, not even the splinter, fresh air. What was this disgusting? This is your fight. It must be done. I can't fight it. I can't. Not alone. Can't do it like this. Can't do it alone.
You are not alone. There are many who are with you, who believe in you. You must make your stand here, against this abomination.
But I am not strong enough. It has bested each and every one of my defenses.
Nonsense. You are stronger than you think you are. The struggle against the worst that animation has to offer is arduous, and few have fought as bravely as you have. You have fought many battles, won many victories, and have rekindled hope.
Hope?
You show people that lack of effort can be noticed, and effort can still be praised in this era where creativity is dying. You have the blessing of everyone who knows that their hard work will not go in vain. If not by you, then by someone. Each blessing is a stone to fortify your land. Your castle is strong. Your allies are numerous. Wield what lies within. Wield the sword of hope, and conquer this almighty foe.
Yes. It must be done. Let's do this.
In the Problem Solvers, it progressed to keeping calm while dealing with something terrible.
My eyes! Ow! Okay, you fuckers. That's it. It is so on. I am taking whatever's left of this piece of shit down!
Stop!
I don't have time for this, old man. This show nearly left me blind. I don't want to know what kind of damage this has actually done to me.
Sometimes the louder that you shout, the less the people will hear you.
What's that supposed to mean?
I told you. You weren't ready for Renseek's help. It changed you too much. You're becoming angrier, more brutal, and more sporadic.
So what? It allowed me to take on some of the worst, things I can never imagine taking on. Once upon a time, the splinter made me vomit. Now I laugh at the person I once was. I have the power to take on anything now.
Power is nothing without grace. You may know how to unleash all this anger, but there's still much you have to learn. There's a where and when, and now is not the time.
Look around you, old guy. This is the worst design show I've ever seen. A show has never given me this much eye strain before. I can barely keep my eyes open. How can this be not the time to release my inner anger?
Because this is one of the worst things that you've ever seen.
I don't get you.
Any man can get angry when fighting a foe or a dragon, but the man who can stay calm in the face of even the greatest adversary is the one who most often wins. Sometimes the stronger blow isn't the one that wins, but the one that sees the weak point in the heat of the heaviest, fastest battle.
Right. I never used to be able to talk. There was always this inner storm that I could never get out. Now that it is out, I can't seem to contain it.
If you can do it here, you can do it anywhere. Finish this review.
Alright, I'll try. And I'll try to do it calmly.
Here, John is giving himself a pep talk so he can continue giving controversial opinions on current topics. Also known as exactly what he's been doing without trouble for the past half a fucking hour. And that's really the thing that bothers me here. It's not just that this diatribe comes out of nowhere, it's that it's so poorly written, especially compared to Enter's other works. It's basically just him saying, I don't want to do this, and then the robot saying, you have to do this, and then Enter saying, but I don't want to, and the robot saying, but you have to, and then Enter eventually says, oh, okay, I'll do it. Now, tell me, which one sounds more interesting? That, or the two clips I just showed you? Which one has more emotional impact? Which one is actually meaningful?
And the worst part about this prep talk, it was essentially dragged out. Look, I get sort of what you're going for, but you can just say, it's okay to have a hot take because it's human nature.
I know that. It just seems so futile, so pointless. Like, can I ask a question here? Is literally anything I say going to change anyone's mind? Just one person. Because I'm getting tired of speaking into the void.
But remember, if you want to change someone's mind, you get the fucking idea. How far are we into this?
We're just about to reach the halfway mark of the video.
You mean we're only halfway there, halfway there, halfway there.
Seeing people literally comment that they are okay with other people committing suicide if that means that they personally don't have to get sick, even if they are not in an age group where they are at significant risk of any complications.
And here we are yet again with Enter making this hypothetical point that no one has actually said whatsoever. Even if for whatever fucked up reason that people have said that, to which I could argue that this is not the majority of people who are in support of lockdowns, but whatever. Then call them out on this. Why are you leaving us in the dark when you may or may not have seen people say that they're okay if someone decides to kill themselves? In fact, if we're going to play your game here, I've been hearing Republicans saying that we should have sacrificed our grandmothers for the economy, or the fact that we should inject everyone with the virus so that our precious little economy wouldn't be hurt by this. And no, I'm not kidding about that last part.
The catalyst? Just watch your local news. There's your catalyst. Of course. People are getting nervous. And listen, I'm not a doctor. All I know is think about how the world would be if you tried to quarantine everybody because of the generic type flu. Now, I'm not saying this is the generic type flu, but maybe we'd be just better off if we gave it to everybody, and then in a month it would be over, because the mortality rate of this probably isn't going to be any different if we did it that way than the long-term picture. But the difference is we're wreaking havoc on global and domestic economies.
Something to know about Rick Santelli, if what Wikipedia is telling me is true. He's Republican, even though he's on CNBC. And yeah, sure, he apologizes. But it felt like he was apologizing because he was forced to do it instead of being sincere. And yet, you don't want to pitch in and say something about that? About how they're advocating for more deaths so that they can make the economy have a thing in D&D? But oh no, mental health is hugely more important. When both physical and mental health should be important, ya doofus.
I also want to point out, in Enter's Plague of Moral Convenience video, he specifically says that even if he was going to die of COVID-19, that would not change his opinion on lockdowns or on masks or on anything regarding the pandemic that he said.
I want to make this clear about my conviction. Even if I were on my deathbed due to the virus, I would still keep my convictions and my belief in the lack of efficacy of lockdowns, and that the negative consequences they cause are too great. That's because it's what a conviction is. It's something you will keep to, no matter what the world around you says, because you truly believe that the consequences are not worth this.
Which, side note, I wouldn't call that a conviction so much as I'd call that mindless dogmatism, but okay. But even then, why is it okay for Enter to keep his opinion in extreme circumstances, but not for the people who disagree with him?
Oh, speaking of Enter's other videos, if you guys have seen Enter's How the World Ended video, he might make a rebuttal on this point by saying this part here.
Because of the media reporting, there's been a stereotype that anti-lockdown people just want haircuts, or they want to sacrifice grandma for the stock market. If you take me seriously as someone who doesn't fall into one of those strawman arguments, I will take you seriously as someone who wants genuine knowledge and information.
And to that, I say, at least I have actual evidence about those on the right. Sure, they're anecdotal, but at least I have some that do say that. The closest thing that isn't anecdotal is with the haircut thing, as a Vox article talks about why haircuts became a focus on the anti-lockdown protests, specifically citing that people would literally travel even hundreds of miles to just get a haircut in Yuba and Salter counties in California. Or how about when, during the anti-lockdown protests in Michigan, there was a demonstration by having people cut someone else's hair. This right here is further proof that some of these anti-lockdown protests do want some of these things to happen. In fact, one of the main reasons why protesters even protest in the first place is so that they can go back to work, which will essentially have them not care about their loved ones or could potentially spread the virus onto other people, specifically to customers, just like how two stylists at a Missouri branch of Great Clips tested positive for the coronavirus and were found to have exposed more than 100 customers to the disease. So in all honesty, I wouldn't really say that this is considered to be a straw man, considering that this is actually happening. You could then say that this is a sweeping generalization, but even if it is, it does paint a very bad picture on the right who only does this for their own selfish desires instead of others.
I spent my first years on this platform telling people that going massively into debt for college might be a bad idea, and they just looked at me like I was telling them that magic existed. Now, we have people with like PhDs and master's degrees serving Starbucks, wondering where their life went wrong. But like the possibility that college might not be the right path for them, or that getting a degree in bullshit doesn't automatically guarantee them a good job, was a complete unreality, and a teenager going to college was just as scientifically certain as the sun rising in the morning.
And yet, only 42% of Americans go to college after high school.
Also, in the beginning of your point, you're exaggerating about student loans and how we're going into massive debt, when that's not the case. Even though 1/3 of the people leave college with no debt, of those who do have debt, the average is about $27,000. Sure, it's high, but with you saying massively into debt, it begs the question of, what numbers are you talking about? 6 digits worth? Because when it comes to debt, it's not $100,000, and it's definitely not $200,000. Oh, and do we need to mention that you've ignored the possibility of having scholarships and grants? Because that's a thing worth mentioning. And then that whole, you end up working at Starbucks anyway bit. Look, you do have to understand that when it comes to the profession that you want to achieve, you do need to have a degree in it. Otherwise, you'll not get the job unless you're lucky. Now, can it be done? Sure, but trying to find a job with only a high school diploma is considered to be worse. As of May the 7th, 2021, even when during that time period we're heading back to normal within the pandemic, those with only a high school diploma had a 6.9 unemployment rate, and those with a bachelor's degree or higher education have a 3.5 unemployment rate. Back in December of 2012, back when the Time magazine article was made, it was generally the same, with 8.5% unemployment for high school grads, and 3.8% for college grads with a bachelor's degree or higher education. To quote the article for just a sec, that's partially because the qualities of good students, intelligence, say, or punctuality, are shared by good employees. But the fact is that many employees simply wouldn't consider applicants without college degrees, and the worse the job market is, the more employers will be able to demand degrees. Not only that, but only 14.3% with a high school diploma would actually make more than those with a bachelor's degree, which is usually not a lot, so you'll more than likely end up earning less. But let's say that you do have the degree, and they reject you. The thing is that no profession is guaranteed to land you a job easily. You have to compete with other people, and sometimes employers just aren't looking for people fresh from school. The student runs into trouble because they are on the hook for a massive loan they have to pay off every month, so if they can't land a job they were trained for to help pay that, they are going to struggle and end up doing Starbucks just to get by. And then you'll end up with those kinds of horror stories that I guess you're using to make. The thing about it is that it's actually the issue of the cost of education. Think of it like buying a car or a house. Most people can't pay for that stuff out of pocket, so that they have to take out a loan to pay for it. When they use the money to get the degree, the person/bank they took the loan from is going to ask for that money plus interest back on the planned monthly payment. If the student can't pay that, then they start to run into trouble. So if the student can't land the job they were hoping for so that they can pay enough to cover the monthly payment while give them enough money to live comfortably, they're going to end up working harder to make enough money to pay that payment and use whatever's left to survive, which usually isn't much. What I find fault in this argument is you're trying to blame the student for that, which isn't going to solve this problem. And it sounds like you want to persuade people to not risk that and do something else with their life. But you can probably see some problems with telling students to avoid becoming doctors or lawyers or animators or etc. Don't blame the people for wanting to go to college. Blame the system that makes it easier to trap people in. In fact, I don't see you making an overall solution to what you've stated. So, what would you think would be the overall case towards fixing the educational costs, Mr. Enter? Essentially put, the main reason why no one took you seriously at your now deleted journal entry about your opinions on college is because you made shitty arguments. Either because the points that you made weren't true, or that you used bad reasoning.
By the way, I actually found a mirror of Enter's original journal on college because despite him saying he was using this platform in a YouTube video to talk about this, he actually only talked about it on DeviantArt primarily. And here's a quote that I found to be kind of interesting. Let me just say that I am not critiquing your lifestyle or your choice to go to college. If you chose to go to college, it was most likely the right choice for you. Compare this to John's new position, which I guess can be best summed up as, in the long run, we're all working at Starbucks.
And a country going into lockdown when they have an outbreak of a disease, despite not being recommended by health authorities past or present.
The invention of quarantining is quite literally the thing that stopped the Black Plague from killing all of Europe. What are you talking about?
Also, that's a fucking lie. Let's go ahead and compare this to the Spanish flu back in 1918 and some of the city's lockdowns. Philadelphia did nothing about locking down the city until after the death rate began skyrocketing just 8 days afterwards. They've endured the highest peak death rate of all cities studied. Compare that to New York City, where they've locked down just 11 days before the death rate spiked. They had the lowest death rate on the eastern seaboard, just a little under 100 deaths away from St. Louis, where they had a strong social distancing measures and a low total death rate. Even though they did delay its peaks in deaths, they did face a sharp increase when restrictions were temporarily relaxed. If you had noticed when it comes to the lockdown procedures during the COVID pandemic, you'll see that whenever they tried to slowly ease the restrictions, the cases and death rates climb back up. If we do the lockdowns, then not only would it help with making sure that the virus doesn't mutate enough to the point where we're in an endless cycle, but also how doctors wouldn't get overwhelmed and more people would die because they aren't able to care for them, due to the fact that they're being overwhelmed.
Is just as scientifically certain as entropy. Our pandemic efforts in 2020 convinced me of only one thing. We are doomed as a species. Doomed to do the song and dance every fucking time. Maybe burning witches is a bad idea. No, if we don't, God will condemn us. Maybe manifest destiny is a bad idea. No, see the shining sea. Maybe interning the Japanese is a bad idea. No, we need to be safe. Maybe the war on drugs is a bad idea. No, we need to be safe. Maybe the war on terror is a bad idea. No, we need to be safe. Maybe lockdowns are a bad idea. No, we need to be safe.
I'm sorry, did you just have a big brain moment and compare the lockdowns to the Japanese internment camps, burning the riches, or the war on drugs? Oh, I'm sorry, I meant a little brain moment, because these comparisons are just stupid when they all had nothing to do with locking down the country to keep people safe. At least there's scientific evidence about lockdown procedures and masks, whereas the rest of the things that you've listed are about fear-mongering and all that crap.
But infinity sign E9E MTR, didn't you know manifest destiny was argued through germ theory, which didn't exist yet?
I'm sorry, did you just decide to justify the practice of manifest destiny here?
Yes. Now fuck you.
You're getting cancelled.
Joke's on you, I'll just turn off the fucking monitor.
A lot of people wonder what's going to cause the end of the world. You know, many people claim nuclear war or global warming, or maybe an asteroid. Let me get rid of all of those fears. I know exactly what's going to kill off humanity. Humans will kill the human race. That is an absolute certainty at this point.
Nuclear war is a human cause. Why did you include it in the first place?
And no, I don't mean by nuclear war or conquest. Just the opposite, really. The human race will destroy itself trying to save itself. Because it's more and more apparent that the human desire to save itself is one of the most destructive forces in the entire universe.
What do you mean not by nuclear war or conquest when you said that last part? You can have the same effect with the nuclear warfare by claiming that you're trying to save the human race from a tyranny government in a different country, or even if, by your logic, trying to not start another US Civil War. Like, what do you freaking mean that's not the same thing? Like, what the fuck?
You do know that we stockpiled nuclear weapons during the Cold War specifically to save ourselves, right? It was a theory called mutually assured destruction. So basically what Enter is saying is that we're going to kill ourselves through the nuclear weapons we created specifically to save ourselves because we're dedicated towards saving ourselves. My head hurts.
My voice hurts more.
What was I talking about again?
The Arthur Mask PSA.
Oh yeah, aren't we, like, going back to the review or something? I would like to get off this speeding train here.
No, I wasn't talking about that. I was talking about how nothing I say on this is going to matter.
God damn it! This train has no brakes! Thomas the Tank Engine has no brakes!
I'm not usually a determinist, but this has proven to be futile. I could say gloobity globbity glorp, and it'd be worth that fucking documentary I made that had over 150 sources.
Here's where Cameron goes berserk.
I mean, even if I shot with their side on this one, they still wouldn't listen to me. I mean, I could say that the science of this PSA is outdated, and apparently now you need to wear 2 masks. Even if you're vaccinated, which is great incentive to get vaccinated, by the way, guys.
The screenshot you showed just says that wearing 2 masks has the same effect as wearing 1 mask that is tighter than normal. Do you even read what you put on screen, John?
And it's not worrying at all that a Dutch study that talked down the effectiveness of masks was afraid it couldn't find a publisher, because consensus is the most important thing to science. That's why we know that the sun revolves around the Earth. Science should never be controversial ever.
For the record, I know the study John is talking about, and it didn't find masks were ineffective. At worst, it found that masks were less effective than people generally believed, and were no replacement for social distancing, which is what the CDC had already been saying for months.
I, too, have known what Enter is talking about. But only because I found a source that I used from the screenshot. Because here's a fun fact from this article. It's a blog post. A blog post that A, only gives out the author's, Vinay Prasad's, opinion about the Dutch study, and B, isn't necessarily a thing that proves anything. Hell, Enter showcased a part about whether or not the trial should have been published, but Vinay talks about how people have been making the mask mandate way too political, and has ironically decided to blame the shift on people like you, because yes, I do personally think that you're making this a political issue. Honestly, I really do not think that this should have been shown in the video via in that screenshot. If you really wanted to talk about that Dutch study, then actually look through the scientific article that the blog post linked. That way you have a much stronger case about your screwed up point about how masks don't work.
And I get it. I really do. We all need to have a completely unquestioned priest or preacher who is infallible no matter how many times that Fauci's lied. Masks, asymptomatic spread, herd immunity percentage.
When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is.
Wait, John, I thought that was your opinion on masks. So you saying it is true, but Fauci saying it is him lying? That doesn't make any sense. I get the point is supposed to be that Fauci later contradicted this, but again, that's not what a lie is. That's called flip-flopping, which, yes, is a different thing.
That even if there is some asymptomatic transmission, in all the history of respiratory-borne viruses of any type, asymptomatic transmission has never been the driver of outbreaks. The driver of outbreaks is always a symptomatic person. Even if there's a rare asymptomatic person that might transmit, an epidemic is not driven by asymptomatic carriers.
Those are 3 major times that Fauci has lied.
Actually, Fauci lied only once. The interesting thing about that second clip that he showed off was that it was recorded back in January of 2020, when less information about the coronavirus was discovered. Now, more information has come out, and we're seeing information about how asymptomatic cases are transmitting the virus over to other people. To prove this point, one research article made by Michael A. Jonasson cited that 60% of all new coronavirus cases are from asymptomatic individuals, and that, of the 30% of the asymptomatic individuals, they remain 75% as infectious as those who developed symptoms. The same thing can be said about the first one, where the first clip was made on March the 8th, 2020, on an interview with 60 Minutes, where he made the comment along the lines of, "There's no reason to be rocking around with a mask." The CDC actually updated its previous advice and recommends people to wear a mask. Specifically, cloth face coverings in public settings when around people outside their household, especially when social distancing measures are difficult to maintain. The only lie that Fauci made was the screenshot where Fauci said that he can nudge up the herd immunity. Sure, it's a noble lie because Fauci wanted to make sure that less people can get sick, but it's still a lie. So with that being said, I generally don't know why you're saying that the information that we've gotten towards the 2 clips that you've showed us was considered to be a lie. Because he's not deliberately hiding any information, aka not telling the truth to the people. It's more so that new information came out and that he was mainly wrong on his previous statements.
I mean, even if masks do nothing, they don't have any negative effects. You know, besides the excessive police brutality all across the world, getting people to turn on each other.
So 2 of the issues with masks are that people act like shit. That doesn't make any sense. Also, John trying to link police brutality with masks is at best spurious. Seriously, thinking about all the high-profile cases of police brutality throughout 2020, and there were a lot, remember, basically none of them had anything to do with masks. George Floyd didn't, Breonna Taylor didn't, Jacob Blake didn't, Rashad Brooks didn't, and although this was a case of a citizen's arrest and not the police, Ahmaud Arbery didn't. This is also ignoring the fact that, and I don't know if you know this, John, police brutality occurred before 2020. Rodney King didn't get beaten up by cops in 1991 because Fauci said in 2020 that you should wear a mask.
Oh, and Canada recalling masks that contain graphene, which Canada more or less mandated people to wear, because there are health risks associated with graphene. You know, graphene, something that Google, the greatest scientific authority in the world, was pretty confident in until the start of April.
Wait, I thought that Google was just a search engine based upon capitalistic values, to the point where they can fetch results to make more money. Was I being lied to then?
One of these days, you follow the science people should look up thalidomide and see what happens when you use these medical advancements and apparati without proper testing. Be warned, the pictures can be considered quite disturbing. Children born without limbs often are.
Okay, I assume John is talking about the sleeping medication that was briefly made available in Europe in the late 1950s. The one that was much safer than the most popular alternative, which was killing 100,000 people a year, by the way. Now, John is right to say that it led to birth defects among women who used it, and that we did not test for it. The reason we didn't test for it is because we didn't even realize that was possible yet. To give you an idea on just how far behind we were regarding how sensitive fetuses are in utero, we didn't even realize smoking while pregnant was a bad idea until the 1970s. John, how much testing do we need to do before we can rule out something that we don't even think can happen?
Honestly, this reminds me of a point that Enter made in this pandemic video.
Hey, Ephrom and Post here. I even have a different avatar now. First one to say who this is in the comments gets their comment pinned, by the way. I normally don't do this. In fact, I criticized somebody for doing something very similar to this not that long ago, but given that this is a co-op, I feel like it's more justified here. Basically, the original idea was I was going to play this clip unedited, and then MTR was going to make a point about it. However, John says some absolutely ridiculous things here that I really feel like I need to point out. And to be honest, I thought it would sound too weird if it was just me commentating on this specific clip in a completely different video with no input from MTR, so I'm doing it in post with the Necklace Wonder here as my avatar. That either completely gave it away or confused you more.
I've heard people talk about mandatory vaccines in their panic. Well, with the anti-vaxxer movement, I've heard this one come up a lot in recent years, but it's at the forefront now, and it is a terrible idea. To put it bluntly, mandatory vaccines are a human rights abuse, and every dictator in history would love to have something like that. Honestly, my frustrations with short-sighted people have been bubbling for a very long time now, and this is just the apex of it. But let me put it like this. A government that injected pregnant women with plutonium to see what would happen.
John? Isn't that why all research is done? To see what would happen? Unless you're implying these experiments were just done for funsies, in which case you're wrong on that account. These experiments started because at the tail end of the Manhattan Project, scientists wanted to determine the effects of radiation on the human body. And yeah, if you are doing that, you are going to have to test women, considering they are half the population, and include women who are undergoing a natural biological function like pregnancy. Now, none of this is me saying that I agree with everything the federal government did during these experiments, if only because they did not get proper informed consent from many of the people who they injected with plutonium. But this on its own is not inherently unreasonable. unreasonable.
They hired a service which unknowingly gave LSD to college students.
Okay, we can all see you're using the Wikipedia page for MKUltra. The problem is, it doesn't actually say that. Actually going to Wikipedia's MKUltra page and checking for the section on experiments on LSD finds that the primary targets were prostitutes, drug addicts, prisoners, and mental patients, along with a surprising amount of government employees. Nothing about college students specifically being given LSD is even mentioned.
An environment where it was legally allowed and encouraged to forcibly sterilize mentally handicapped people up until the 1970s.
Okay, I just have no idea where he got the 1970s for this figure. Buck v. Bell was greatly weakened by Skinner v. Oklahoma, and then eugenics became illegal by proxy through the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. State governments also rarely enforced sterilization laws past the 1950s, so we have a whole series of dates John could have picked from, and he still ended up picking the wrong one.
With a medical apparatus that propagated Tuskegee, in a place where lobotomies were the established science.
Lobotomies were the established science? John, you know lobotomies are a procedure, not a science, right? Or do you mean they were unquestionable orthodoxy among doctors? Because that's also not entirely true. Sure, they were performed for a long period of time. However, they were always questioned from the beginning because, well, the entire idea was you would make somebody more mentally healthy via cutting out part of their brain. And that just didn't make sense to a lot of people. And it turned out those people were right.
Which had such a great eugenics program that Hitler wrote a love letter to it.
No, Hitler wrote a fan letter to one specific American eugenicist, that being Madison Grant, the author of the 1924 book, The Passing of the Great Race. In fact, the article specifically makes mention that American eugenicists were commonly envious of what Hitler was able to do, with the article directly saying, Leon Whitney, executive secretary of the American Eugenics Society, declared of Nazism, quote, while we were pussyfooting around, the Germans were calling a spade a spade.
Does not get the right to mandate something like forced injections. Ever. No matter how annoying Karen is on Facebook.
Anyway, that's all I had to say. Back to you, MTR, and Ephrom in the past, I guess.
Now, I want to state before arguing here that, no, I'm not going to be talking about whether or not we should have vaccine mandates. In fact, both of us are going to agree with Enter here that we shouldn't have vaccine mandates because of legitimate exceptions for someone who cannot take a vaccine, such as immunocompromised people.
Or in my case, because I do agree with John that they are needlessly authoritarian and blatantly, in the case of the United States, unconstitutional.
However, what I am arguing about here is that Enter is comparing these past clinical studies, such as the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, to a vaccine that has multiple testing phases before it goes to the public. You know, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments involves injecting black men with syphilis and just observing them over the course of the study, which is something where we're not preventing someone from getting sick, but just observing someone getting sick. I essentially do not get your over arguments here, because you're essentially saying that the public will suffer if we're taking a vaccine that's been proven to be safe, versus a couple of studies that aren't comparable to the vaccine. Honestly, I'm starting to suspect that your favorite fallacy, other than the false dichotomy fallacy, would be the false equivalence fallacy, because you're pretty much comparing apples to oranges here.
Even then, what John was saying was totally irrelevant to the conversation. Mandatory vaccines aren't bad because Tuskegee happened. Hell, in the clip he specifically says the United States government shouldn't do such a thing because of that, the plutonium files, and eugenics, which also implies that had those things not happened, John would be fine with vaccine mandates. So John's issue, in his words, is that other bad things have happened. Not even that vaccine mandates allow for other bad things to happen, just that other bad things have happened in the past. Going back to a point I made a little bit ago, why can John have all the strong opinions he wants no matter the circumstances, but nobody else can?
Anyways, the main reason why I've decided to bring that clip up was because it felt like as if this was the same issue that you're making. Within this section here, you're comparing a mask mandate in Canada, something in which case I will concede about by saying that Canada should have been better towards making sure that the masks weren't poisonous, to something in which case that was mainly used more as an overall prescription rather than something in which case that was an overall mandate. Again, I generally don't know as towards what your overall process is, because you've decided to use the sleeping medication to help your overall argument about the mask that the children had to use in Canada.
According to this PSA, because Muffy is wearing a mask, it is absolutely okay for her father to have this big blowout sales event for cars, which will most likely encourage a mass gathering. The most essential thing to buy in a pandemic. This goes on without any sort of shaming or criticism whatsoever. Really responsible to encourage mass gatherings, Arthur.
I really love the assumptions that you're making here. Look, what I will concede on is making a big blowout sales event for motorized vehicles is kinda stupid in hindsight when it comes down to the pandemic, but we don't know if there's going to be a lot of people in this place, nor are we going to assume that they're not practicing social distancing protocols. I mean, this is never mind that, considering that you probably want me to link at least one thing that's considered right-leaning, I guess. The Wall Street Journal reported that car sales were down almost 20% during the pandemic, with Car and Driver saying that by the end of the year, sales were down from 14.9 to 15.5% overall. Yeah, they've tried to rebound back near the end of the year, but at the beginning of the pandemic in the US, we saw places to be mostly barren. We don't know where they're in time-wise because of the fact that they're in the pandemic right now, just like us out in the real world, so we don't know if things are going back to normal, or if they're slightly easing restrictions during that time period. And no, I'm not counting the upload date of the PSA in question. So it's more than likely that not a lot of people showed up at the sales event because they want to keep abiding social distancing protocols.
Honestly, I'm just confused by John's point here. So, it's absolutely insane to buy a car during a pandemic, and that's why he thinks everyone is going to be at a car sale during a pandemic. Nothing about this makes any sense.
That being said, keep the part that Muffy's father had a job outside of his house during the pandemic in mind, as this will be important for a future discussion.
You got any other pieces of advice?
If we all do our part, we can get rid of this virus.
You disgust me, viscerally. Let me be the bearer of bad news, Arthur. COVID is endemic. We're not getting rid of this virus entirely. The best we can do is defend against it. In all of human history, we've only eradicated one virus. That was smallpox. Nowadays, it only exists in a lab, and that's after we got a vaccine in 200 years for a virus that's less infectious than COVID. Seriously, if you fuck around in the Arizona desert, you could still get the Black Plague. You know, the one that killed like a third of the world's population.
Okay, John, you do know we can't create a vaccine for the Black Plague, right? With that said, if you catch it today, there are actually ways of treating it. You might have heard of them. They're called antibiotics. And by the way, effective treatment is what people typically mean when they say, get rid of this virus.
I'm just wasting my breath and making my throat sore for no reason. It's a moot point anyway. Everything I just said means nothing to no one. Just like virtually every fucking wear a mask statement that's ever been said. All of it amounts to a grand total of shit! We've learned this with abstinence-only education. Just telling people to do something like this has a backfire effect if it does anything at all.
Ah yes, mask mandates and abstinence-only education. The two genders. But seriously, the reason why abstinence-only education doesn't work is because humans are biologically programmed to want to have sex. Are humans biologically programmed to not want to wear a mask? Because if so, you need to present evidence of that claim, which you haven't.
What's the story been since Fauci flip-flopped? That's right, wearing one mask is all it takes to basically save lives. One mask is a perfect magic bullet. Here's the funny thing. If wearing two masks is really important, that means that every single time you've only been wearing one mask, you've been spreading the virus! But I guess that's not a problem, unless you've assumed that the mask is 100% effective at any point in time.
even though the CDC did not make a recommendation to wear 2 masks towards any normal circumstances. They only did recommend people to wear 2 masks if you have a beard, and neither of which is a mask filter or brace, nor have you shaved the beard close to your face. However, the interesting thing about what Enter said was that Dr. Fauci didn't advise it. On January the 25th, 2021, he appeared on the Today Show in an interview where he said this: "If you have a physical covering with 1 layer, you put another layer on. It just makes common sense that likely would be more effective, and that's the reason why you see people either double masking or doing a version of an N95. He did not advise people to double up, but he thought that it was common sense for people to do. Afterwards, he appeared to answer some questions from members of the AFT, or the American Federation of Teachers, and the NEA, or the National Education Association, where he said, and I quote, "The CDC has not changed any of its recommendations about mask wearing in the sense of saying wear 2 masks or do an N95. They haven't gone there. They have just said everybody should wear a mask." To even further prove this, Ellie Klen on Twitter posted a video where Fauci said this directly after what I've said in the quote.
There are many people who feel, you know, if you really want to have an extra little bit of protection, maybe I should put 2 masks on. There's nothing wrong with that, but there's no data that indicates that that is going to make a difference. And that's the reason why the CDC has not changed the recommendation.
If anything, he never flip-flopped, or at least I don't recall him flip-flopping in that sense. You can still wear 1 mask, but if you want to be safe, you can double up. However, there was no data about doubling up to begin with, so there was no recommendation on the CDC website. He only thought that it was common sense and didn't advise anyone against it, but he also didn't recommend it.
Meanwhile, because I am skeptical of masks, I have basically just stayed home and ordered things online and stayed away from other people. It's been hell on my psyche and the walls in my house move every single day, but this is how you properly social distance.
Look, I'm honestly sorry if for whatever reason that I'm using a term that might be considered to be an SJW terminology, but Enter over here is actually pretty privileged enough to at least have a job inside his household. Meanwhile, other Americans simply couldn't afford to stay inside during the pandemic and had to work remotely. Even if Enter acknowledged somewhere on the internet that he was complaining about people who can't afford to stay home, he also ignored that opening up the country during the pandemic would actually harm people in poverty, which would make them and their loved ones get the disease. I mean, there's also that he dismissed the idea about the government giving people money during the pandemic in order for them to stay alive, as well as saying that healthcare shouldn't be a human right during one of his other videos on his other channel. That's more than likely taken down, but people such as YouTube Dude have went ahead and covered that. So let's head back to Muffy's stat back in 5 interjections ago. Ignoring that him working at a car dealership is considered to be an essential workplace. In fact, let's play the twisted game of pretend that being a car dealer is not essential. And while I still agree with you that the writers of the PSA shouldn't use the phrase big sales event, though I'm still a little bit annoyed at the assumptions you've made, I could see where Muffysad is going. This is because Muffysad can't afford to stay at home, and with car sales dropping at the start of the pandemic, he needs to persuade people to buy more cars so that he can earn more money in order to keep his house. Without that, then his family would be on the streets. This in turn could create issues such as spreading the virus faster. If the government would have provided more money for people during the pandemic, then they can stay at home longer without having to be in fear of eviction notices or getting essential items like food or water. Too long didn't listen. It's good that you're staying outside at home during the pandemic, but you're ignoring those who simply can't stay indoors.
Whether masks work or they don't, my conscience is clear. How about you? Because if this does turn out to be security theater, it can have a major backfire effect. So you better hope, for your sake, for all of our sakes, that 1 mask is effective enough. Instead of, you know, all of our protocols and all of our advancements being so useless you still need to do all of this shit even after taking a vaccination.
If the protocols are useless, why would we keep doing them? Anyway, did you guys know that this was going to be originally in the same video as part 2? I kinda had to cancel that for what should be obvious reasons. Join us next time where John talks about race, and let me just warn you, that is the worst part of the video. Good night, and good luck. This is part 4 of a commentary I'm doing with 8363 MTR on the mysterious Mr. Enter. If you have not seen the first 3 parts yet, which total over 2 hours, I'd recommend doing so before going forward.
Has Arthur done anything else? Because this debate just gets me in such a foul mood.
I can't believe someone would be hurt like that, just because they're black.
Wow, what a funny, epic Maymay, XD. We're already off to a great start. You know, if you can't tell by my incredibly well-done sarcasm that is about as original as Enter's meme choices.
Yeah, I don't even care for the fact that I'm being called out for this next point about me nitpicking here, but it really says something that both Enter and Coda Adofia have no taste in memes. Seriously, that clip is overused to the point where I didn't laugh at it. It was so predictable that I could see it from a mile away, and I'm actually getting a headache from it. Do you really want me to play a clip of my co-op commentary with Space Screw 5 about Head On as a placebo? Because I'm still feeling that migraine after all of these years. Oh, I'm sorry. Not enough nitpicks? Alright, let's talk about the second reason as to why we've been doing these synopses towards these PSAs. And to start off, your transitions are shit. There are moments in the video where you've placed in the subtitle card of the cartoon that you're reviewing, like Bun Control, for example, but it's not consistent with the other parts of the review, where Enter just gives us whiplash after whiplash of what else he's reviewing. It also doesn't help too that even if it was clear as day as he was talking about another Arthur PSA, it did come off as a little bit confusing considering that he then made it absolutely, without a single of a doubt, very, very, very clear that he's reviewing another PSA. In fact, he actually jumped right into the review of the other PSA and didn't have enough time to talk about the synopsis of this next PSA. This brings me to a big point that I need to make. It's that Enter doesn't explain the synopsis of these PSAs, or at the very least doesn't do a very good job at that, such as Bun Control and how he only mainly talks about the climax and ending of it. The greenhouse is something in which case that comes closest to it, though he still doesn't do a good job at it because it seems like he's bouncing around in the episode and mainly just rants about renewable energy like how an old man would scream at a cloud. This is actually a huge issue because he's assuming that his audience will actually know what the synopsis for each episodes or PSAs, when yet I'll even be honest when I say that I haven't seen about half of what Enter talked about, such as the Greenhouse episode or any of the Arthur PSAs or even Lil Dicky's song too. And I'll be honest when I say that I prefer not to listen to that Lil Dicky song anymore. Like, I'm not saying that you shouldn't assume your audience is dumb, but at the very least, assume that your audience might not know the source material and explain it. You kinda have went in and done that with Strange Magic, though I wish that you didn't jump around, but I could be wrong about that review. And you've done it during the episodic reviews earlier back then. What happened to that? Also, I'm not saying that you should do what Nostalgia Critic does and riff the source material as you move along, but at the very least, don't try to leave information out. Speaking of Little Dicky, I can get that it's either difficult or impossible to explain the synopsis for a song. But what you could have done was explain what the song was, or who Little Dicky was, or the fact that other artists like Ariana Grande and Justin Bieber were in the song too. Or really anything else to get audience members follow along with it. So, with that being said, would you, Ephrom, like to make the synopsis for the second Arthur PSA?
Gladly! The second Arthur PSA has Arthur wanting to chat with Buster after the both of them saw a video about someone treating a black individual unfairly. They didn't reference George Floyd. In fact, Buster directly says, quote, "How could it happen here in Elwood City?" So it could potentially be just someone bullying a black kid because they're black. After discussing it for a bit, Arthur gets the idea to invite Mrs. Grady into the video chat so she can talk about how important it is to stand up against racism, and that it could happen to anyone. Her solution is to talk about it and not be afraid to ask questions about the issue while acting out and standing up against it. After that, Arthur and Buster decide to ask their parents about racism and leave the video chat, while she talks to the audience to have people remember to talk, listen, and act. At the very end, there's a still screen about remembering John Lewis, the civil rights activist and former United States representative who died of pancreatic cancer.
So, I'm going to need you to point out the problems with Arthur tackling this particular subject matter. If you don't get it, let me explain. In Arthur, the characters, don't have race. They have species of animals, yes, like aardvarks and rabbits, but you'd have to be MatPat to assume that they had an in-universe reason.
But hey, that's just a theory. A game theory. Thanks for watching.
Hey MatPat, you just got entered! No one is safe. This video is painful.
This is a conscious choice that many shows made back in the day to make race irrelevant in their world. It was one of the main reasons that shows used anthropomorphic animals. There are no black people in Arthur's universe because there are no people of any race in Arthur's universe.
I mean, true, but we did have characters that are indeed meant to be of certain races. Remember the Brain, or Alan Powers as his real name? In Arthur's Perfect Christmas, he mentions that he celebrates Kwanzaa, a holiday that is celebrated by black people, specifically those of African American culture, between December the 26th to January the 1st. In fact, he also has a cousin named Sheik that's originally from Africa but moved to America. There is also the fact that celebrity guest appearances like Coco Taylor and Taj Mahal, two black celebrities, appeared in animal form. I know that you've jokingly said that you have to be MatPat to make a theory about this, but one thing was certain was that the characters themselves do say the term human. For example, there's the fact that there were countless times where they would say human in the show, such as you are author within the introduction, human treasure lad, not buried treasure, or in season 13 in Paradise Lost, when Kate begins to lose her comprehension of Pal's speech. Pal's a dog, mind you. Amigo, another dog, explains, this happens to all human children. I remember when it happened to Facita. This might just be the writers not knowing what other terminology to use for their species, or wanting the children to not have a hard terminology within the show, or that humans used to be a part of the world until the anthropomorphic animals took over, but this could also be that they themselves do see each other as human, but they only look like animals to the audience. But, alright. Let's play the twisted game of pretend. Let's pretend that this still doesn't matter and that canonically they're anthropomorphic animals. So, question then. Who's the demographic for the show?
Are you asking me?
I mean, this question is really for everybody who's watching this, but sure, the question can apply to you.
I'm going to guess children.
That's not the answer that I was looking for, as I was looking for human children. Ya forgot that we're Homo sapiens. Yeah, it's no duh that they're anthropomorphic, but the thing about that is that they're talking to preschool children who are still developing. I could be wrong about this, so please correct me if possible, but I don't honestly think that there's some children that young who will connect the dots to race with us if they talk about speciesism for them. They know about race in itself. I have a point later on in the video about that, but I don't generally know if they'll be smart enough to equate race with animals. Like, sure, you shouldn't expect children to be dumb, but this is a big topic that children would not connect the dots like this, which is why we need to simplify it if you want to get the message across easily.
We can see this also in things like Doug, where all the characters are Technicolor specifically for this reason.
Even though Doug, the main character, is actually white, and they intentionally made him white.
They also made him bald. Scholars are divided on the reason for this.
According to Jezebel's article, why was Doug from Doug white when everybody else was multicolored? One of the executive producers said in the book Slimed, an oral history of Nickelodeon's golden age, and I quote, "Look, we're not black people, we're not Mexican, but we want the cartoon to speak to all groups. How do we get past the barrier of ethnicity?" And Jim Jenkins, the show's creator, said, "Let's try coloring them all different colors." Even though Jenkins didn't predict the audience to relate Skeeter as being black, though he was fond of it. This wasn't due to privilege-based blindness, nor an accident either. Quoting from the article again, Gus Hassler, one of Nickelodeon's founders, amidst the network's decision to market their programming to kids with cable costume to pander to an affluent, presumed white, market. The others didn't get Nickelodeon. Children who couldn't afford cable were getting some children's programming from PBS. Sure, it brings up issues of diversity and income level. And in some way, even though that wasn't their fault or they didn't plan this out of malicious intent, this was kinda still a problem considering that many of the main protagonists from different shows are predominantly white men/boys, especially back then, and both either in cartoons or real life. There's an article published in 2012 made by Nicole Martins and Kristen Harrison that examines the racial and gender differences in the relationship between children's television use and self-esteem. They only focus on those who are either white or black, and categorize them into 4 groups, that being within their respective race and gender. What they found was that black and white girls, as well as black boys, had a decrease in self-esteem when watching television, and an increase in self-esteem among white boys. Why is that? Well, there's 3 main reasons why. There's the fact that the majority of television content serves to reinforce both gender roles and racial stereotypes, the overall concerns of portrayals of white female characters and black characters on the screen, and it could be due to the fact that television viewing is displacing real-life experiences that might build self-esteem. I mean, fuck, why do you think, especially after your video's release, there were videos within the art community and in the animation community that talks about how diversity in kids shows are extremely important? Essentially, even with the fact that Doug had a colorful cast, and I meant that in a literal way, the main protagonist was actually white because it was, at the time, trying to appeal to white children, presumably mainly white boys, because black children or other children of color might not afford television or cable at the time. In fact, that being the representation in the show, and admittedly your overall point, would have been better if Doug, the character, and his parents were also of a different color.
It's something that even happens to this day. Frisk is yellow in Undertale as well to take race out of the equation.
Because, as we all know, no racial group nor ethnicity is associated with the color yellow.
Actually, Ephrom, what Enter says here is true. The character of Undertale, Toby Fox, did make Frisk in no particular race.
That very well may be true, but my point is more that despite trying to make Fritz racially ambiguous, Toby Fox picked a color already associated with a certain race or ethnicity, in this case the color yellow, which in the real world is commonly associated with the Chinese. This is actually a common pitfall people fall into when they try to make characters that are racially neutral. Usually they just end up making characters that are probably not white.
It's not enough to just say, I'm not racist. It's not my problem. We have to actively fight against racism.
So we get to our final stop on this train. So, in late May of 2020, a man named George Floyd was killed in the hands of police officers. It became another example in a long line of incidences of police brutality aimed specifically at minorities.
Okay, John. All I'm going to say is, this was probably not your best choice for an avatar with that specific image on screen.
But this was a tipping point for many. Protests and civil unrest sparked all across the United States, sometimes ending up as riots. They continued for over 100 days, and there was a sense of outrage among the country. There is a lot of controversy surrounding the situation, and as I record this, the trial is ongoing. The full-body camera footage was actually leaked to the public sometime later, and it mired the situation quite a bit, as well as Floyd having a controversial past, but you'd be hard-pressed to believe that he, or Breonna Taylor, or any of the other numerous individuals who have been shot and killed by police deserve to die. In cases of actual crime, the police are there to apprehend and not to execute. This is a very serious discussion that could probably take up a full video that I'm not entirely comfortable making, but it gave rise to mantras of all cops are family unfriendly expletive.
Okay, John. All I'm going to say is, this was probably not your best choice for an avatar with that specific image on screen. Also, some of you may be wondering why I'm including this segment even though I'm not really commentating on it, and that's because, although I do feel this is the worst part of the video, I don't necessarily think John's understanding of the issue of race is all that bad. It's just incredibly surface level. Remember how John said that the Animaniacs reboot felt like it was written in 2016 but came out in 2018, which, side note, is an incredibly specific way to call something outdated. You'll see what I mean as we go on, but just know that these are the same points you probably heard in like 2016 and 2017, And they didn't really hold water back then, but they especially don't hold water now because, well, we tried those things, and look at where it got us. If you want to know why radical ideas become appealing, John, it's because moderation fails. It's really that simple. And this is what makes this whole talk John did earlier about reaching out to the other side so frustrating. Because if John would have actually talked to anti-racists, he would see a lot of the points he brings up get addressed. However, he didn't do that, so he's just kind of floundering around for a bit.
Talk about racism with your friends, your parents, your teachers.
Hey Fred, we're about to play some Mario Kart, you want in? Sure, but I think we should talk about how predominantly black schools are underfunded due to a systemically racist Department of Education. Okay Fred, not this again. We're trying to play a fucking game here.
She meant when there's a time and a place for it, not to do that whenever the situation isn't right. Like you're pretty much misinterpreting what the teacher is trying to say here.
Racism is definitely a bad thing and an evil in this world, and it should be fought against. However, not every single person or weapon is equally useful in this attempt. For example, Barbie. Barbie wants to tell you all how bad racism is. Yes, Barbie. The doll. The doll.
Okay, so I guess we're just done with the Arthur PSA now. Love the abrupt lack of transition, really do.
Now, normally we're going to be saying the synopsis for this PSA, but because of not only one mistake that Enter makes, but also with how he doesn't really review the actual PSA except for this next interjection, we're actually going to be holding parts of it off on this PSA for now and save that until later on. After that, except for one other instance, we're going to stop giving out the synopsis for the PSAs because Enter at the very least did his best that he could do in the synopsis department.
Hey everybody.
Oh god, another one of these things. Okay, maybe animated characters should not vlog. Like, seriously, it's weird as hell seeing a cartoon character stare awkwardly at the camera. They're not supposed to do that. 2D or 3D, it barely works in live action. For vlogging to work, you need to be really expressive. And this stilted animation just makes it look uncanny, like a Barbie doll.
So, I remember when someone on Twitter showed 2 clips in one video towards 2 of Enter's points. Specifically the Nikorama review of the X's as well as the Nikorama review of Cat Scratch, where he talks about some of the voice actors from each show.
Hi, Ephrom in Post. You may remember me from the last video. I also have some opinions on this clip that I was just supposed to play unedited, and oh boy, do I kind of want to share them.
This might be just me, but I have a low tolerance for people who are paid to do a specific voice. Again and again and again. It just takes me right out of the experience. It usually breaks my immersion when I can't watch Sarah Lynn from BoJack Horseman without thinking of Mabel from Gravity Falls.
Okay, so John can suspend his disbelief to the point where he can perfectly enjoy a show with anthropomorphic talking horses, but 2 people sounding the same, that just crosses a line for him. He can't believe that.
It is always distracting. Tuesday's friend is Gretchen from Recess. I cannot like your show if you're constantly reminding me of a better show. And they constantly do that with the voice acting. Speaking of which, Patrick Warburton plays the father. I have several issues with this. I really wish, and this sounds completely backwards, but I really wish that people stopped using Patrick Warburton to play Patrick Warburton's famous roles. Every single time I hear Patrick Warburton in a cartoon, I hear Kronk. And guess who he's playing every time he's in a cartoon? He's playing Kronk. Another version of Kronk. Again and again and again and again.
And if you're someone like me who was introduced to Patrick Warburton via his role as Joe Swanson on Family Guy, you're probably incredibly confused right now. It doesn't help that John really doesn't explain what this character and Kronk from Emperor's New Groove have in common. He just kind of says that and expects his audience to accept that. This also ignores why someone might be typecasted. For example, it's perfectly possible that Warburton just chooses to consistently play these roles because that's what he feels like he is best at. I mean, we've all seen cases where an actor has gone into a role that is clearly not right for them, and Warburton just doesn't want to rock that boat and would rather stay where it's safe. Now, is that a good idea for acting? Well, that's up for the actor to decide, but I personally wouldn't say so. However, that's his decision, and you should be petitioning him and not holding it against the show. After all, the best way to get an acting gig in Hollywood is prior experience, and who's going to have the prior experience to play loud, angry characters besides somebody who consistently plays loud, angry characters. You see what I mean here, John? It's this feedback loop. This is also ignoring the fact that this happens in the live-action world, too. This isn't exclusive to animation. I mean, when was the last time you saw Pauly Shore in an Oscar film? That's what I thought.
It's getting old. This is just Kronk that another show stole. Every single time I hear Patrick Warburton playing the same exact role. Cartoons like this just take character acting to another level. Even if that's not true, it's just always the same problem. Not helping is the voice is incredibly similar to Archer's voice from, well, Archer. You know, another cartoon that coincidentally happens to star spies.
Okay, John, what are you implying? That Archer ripped off the X's? And for that matter, they really don't sound similar. Especially considering Archer is played by an entirely different actor, who is also the same actor that plays Bob in Bob's Burgers. This is even lampshaded in an episode of Archer. So I just don't get your point here.
It seems like a relatively normal premise for a cartoon. It follows three cats: Mr. Blick, voiced by Dojo from Shaolin Showdown, Waffle, voiced by Pleakley from Lilo and Stitch, and Gordon, voiced by Scotland. I know that I keep bringing this up over and over again, but this is something that does legitimately bother me. When voice actors use the same voice for every single thing. It's called voice acting, people. Actors play people who are different than themselves. Consider trying it once in a while.
I refer you back to my earlier interjection. If you can believe everything that occurs in Cat Scratch, but you cannot believe that one person in one show sounds similar to another person in another show, then I just don't get how your suspension of disbelief works. I'm sorry, I just don't. People in real life occasionally sound the same. Sorry, it's the truth. I don't even necessarily disagree that Enter's complaint is invalid, although I do find his pretentious way of saying it's called voice acting to be off-putting, to say the least. But with that said, I do think that, to be blunt, it doesn't particularly matter in a cartoon like this. Oh, also, while I'm on a roll, because this has bothered me for years,
there's one more thing about the show that bothers me. It's the voice acting. All of the voice actors are very professional, but they were given absolutely no direction to differentiate themselves from their other roles. You wanna know what I'm talking about? Listen to this.
I'm glad you're finally here. Would you be a dear and fetch my bags, servant girl?
Excuse me? What did you just call me? Servant girl?
Oh, many pardons, or my bad. What do you people call yourselves these days?
Okay, John, I see what you're going for here, but there are two problems. The first one being that Clara's voice is softer than Twilight Sparkle's, meaning that there is a noticeable difference. And second off, am I the only one who thinks it's a little unfair to hold the fact that Twilight Sparkle and Clara sound the same against Drawn Together, considering Drawn Together came out 6 years before Friendship is Magic did? Don't get me wrong, I understand the reason why you're mentally making the connection is most likely because you've watched Friendship is Magic before you watched Drawn Together, but at that point, is it really the fault of the show? Well, I'd say no, and this is something you even acknowledge in your review of Cat Scratch.
If you haven't seen Shaolin Showdown or Lilo and Stitch, well, first of all, watch Lilo and Stitch and maybe consider Shaolin Showdown after you've seen Avatar. But if you haven't, this might not be much of a problem to you.
So again, is it really fair to criticize a show for something that most viewers wouldn't even notice? If anything, that sounds like the definition of nitpicking. Anyway, back to you, MTR.
Why did I bring this up? Well, to quote the mysterious Mr. Enter here, same energy. Same fucking energy. The issues with the two clips that we've played, as well as this interjection here, is that Mr. Enter has put in a rule/guideline that seems either unfair or seems kinda stupid in hindsight when they really shouldn't be a rule to begin with. It comes across as you having this strict way towards doing animations, and it could potentially mean that you might be wrong about this rule/guideline. For example, and from what the OP of that Twitter account said, "You're totally right, Mr. Enter. Voice actors with a distinct voice should be used once and never ever be used again. It's not like this voice acting can require using that distinct voice, and through great acting makes it fit the different personalities." That's crazy. To give an example, that's like saying that you don't like Richard Horvitz voice acting in Hell of a Boss when he sounds exactly like Zim from Invader Zim, even though that these two characters have different personalities. With Moxie, the character that Richard stars in, being more of a focal and realistic of the main cast regarding the workplace that he works in, so less screaming out nonsense and more talking in a calm manner most of the times, even though that he gets easily annoyed. Whereas Zim is usually brash, arrogant, and overconfident. But nope! According to entry standards, Moxie sounds exactly like Zim, with the only exception that Zim swears now. Within this point here, however, you're making an arbitrary rule/guideline about animation because apparently you have a problem with cartoon characters looking at the camera. The issue with this point here is that you're supposed to look at the camera as if you're supposed to look at your audience. Hence the fact that Barbie and her friend Nikki are talking to their audience. It's important to note that when it comes to vlogs, especially when you're sitting down, you need to have engagement with your audience, and looking somewhere else indicates that you're not engaging with your audience, unless if you're not talking about them, or if something important comes up, or even if you're searching at your phone to look up important information, you know, nuances. In some cases, it's the same with your avatar stills and my avatar stills, because you're talking to the audience and you want to stimulate the importance of eye contact. Also, for vlogging work, you need to be really expressive. Honestly, I disagree with your viewpoint on the Barbie vlog. We see Barbie and Nikki smiling, using her hands for movement, having a camera persona, differences in tone, maintaining eye contact, etc. that's considered to be expressive. I don't know where you get the idea that they're not expressive, possibly with the idea that, oh no, they're not moving around, they're stiff. But yet, when they're not moving around like walking, they don't really have anything to do besides sitting in front of a camera and talking to their audience. Like, what else do you really think that they should do? What other actions do you want that needs to be expressive? I am lost at what you want to see as the solution here. Are you expecting them to fidget or something, like touching their hair or do what every other person does? If so, then this might not work in 2D or in 3D because it might be a bit too distracting for people to take in.
This PSA has a problem that the Arthur one does, which is why I'm tackling them next to each other.
People might think that my life looks fine, but the truth is I and so many other black people have to deal with racism.
Now, here's something that I don't know if you've noticed, but this character is, well, a fictional character. Their entire life and every experience within is completely made up. I can show you my character and say that she's had to go through X, Y, and Z as a girl and that sexism is bad, but it doesn't change the fact that I made them up, both the character and the sexism that she's been exposed to.
So novels like To Kill a Mockingbird and The Watsons Go to Burlingham also must do a bad job discussing racism because they're fictional, right? How about anti-war novels like Slaughterhouse-5? Hell, its recollection of the bombings it describes are so historically inaccurate, they rely on the works of people like David Irving. How about anti-sexism novels like The Handmaid's Tale or The Stepford Wives? I mean, nothing in those novels actually happened, so therefore they cannot shine a light on things that actually go on in the real world, right? What about anti-authoritarian novels like 1984? I mean, Winston Smith wasn't real, so how could his character comment on the struggles of living in an authoritarian society? For that matter, I don't think Joseph Stalin was a farm animal, so Animal Farm is also out the window. Do you see the issue with this kind of overall thinking? I mean, John, you're an author yourself. You of all people should know that fiction can be used to shine a light on real-world experiences.
In both of these PSAs, they talk about fictional examples of racism. The Arthur one is more close to what actually happened, but it's so vague that you'll only know what he's talking about if you actually directly know about George Floyd. Meanwhile, not only is the Barbie one made up, it's completely off-screen. It's one thing if it's like in the context of an episode about racism, but these are coming off like actual people trying to talk about a real-world issue, when they're clearly and patently making shit up.
Again, I refer you to my example of Slaughterhouse-5 from a minute ago. A book where the main character uses fucking time travel to see events that didn't actually happen in order to shine a light on the evils of war. You say this is okay if it's in the context of an episode, but that's just a nonsensical standard. So it's okay if you're doing it as part of the story, so long as the story is not delivered through a certain medium?
If the problem is bad, and the problem is bad, you should not need to make up fictional examples. All it does is dilute the problem and look like you're making it a bigger deal than it really is.
You know, I wonder how Enter would have acted during the actual civil rights movement. Hell, I wonder how he would have acted during the abolitionist movement when novels like Uncle Tom's Cabin were coming out. You know, the work that's widely cited as one of the most important pieces of media that caused people to turn against slavery.
Once again, if they did like an actual episode about this, I wouldn't have much of a problem. But no, these PSAs are about fictional events.
Okay, we get it. You don't have to harp on about why we shouldn't need to make shit up for a fictional story. Move on already. My co-op partner's brain is melting with this shit.
I wonder how Enter would react to reading Dracula, considering that novel is made up of journal entries from people who don't exist talking about events that never took place. Now, to be fair, I could understand John's point if the PSA were attempting to pass off these fictional stories as real events. Like, not just fictional attempts to explain real things, but as things that actually did happen. However, considering we're talking about a Barbie PSA and not the protocols of the Elders of Zion, I highly doubt that's the case.
In fact, I want you guys to actually hear Nikki's story here, because this is actually going to be the biggest problem with Enter's point.
Barbie and I had a sticker selling contest on the beach last month. We split up and went different directions to see who could sell the most. Well, while I was on the boardwalk, beach security stopped me 3 times.
What?
They asked me all these questions over and over, and they even called my mom. I never told you, but that's why I sold a few stickers that day. The security officers thought I was doing something bad, even though I was doing exactly what you were doing. And remember when we were going to join that French honor club at school? Mm-hmm. Well, I made a perfect score on the entrance test, but when the teacher, who didn't know me at all, gave me my results, he told me I only did well because I got lucky. He said he knew I couldn't speak French that well.
What? You speak French better than all of us. Why didn't you just stay in the club and prove him wrong?
I don't want to have to constantly prove and reprove myself.
Here's the thing about this, Enter. The story over here wasn't trying to pass off as if this quote-unquote actually happened. These stories were mainly used as an overall tool to not only relate to black audiences who watches the PSA, but also towards using this as an overall tool for kids and adults to listen to black voices, no matter how difficult or awkward it is. For example, for Nikki's first story, it was more so towards how black people have been stopped for things that they were doing nothing wrong towards. There's a study out in California that showed that within the year of 2019, when stopped, black people are more likely to have action taken rather than no action taken, which involves being searched, handcuffed, and curbside detention, whereas white people have less of a chance to be stopped and have an action taken. Not only that, but when police search black, Latino, and Native American people, they're less likely to find drugs, weapons, or other contraband compared to when they search white people. And this isn't actually a place where people are evenly mixed in these states and cities. To give an example of this, only 28% of drivers stopped by LAPD were black. They only account for just 9% of Los Angeles population.
I know what at least some of you are thinking. What? The organization that once beat the shit out of Rodney King for no reason and which hired Mark fucking Furman is still kind of racist to this day? Well, yeah. It turns out that when there's that much racism in an organization, it doesn't really go away when the most vulgar racists leave. It's kind of baked into the system. I don't know what we'd call this kind of racism. It's not really individual. It's more system-based? Systemic? Is that a word? Systemic? Oh yeah, that is a word.
Another example is with Nikki's second story about how people would perceive her as being dumb and that she got lucky. Because there's an overall stereotype against the black community that black people are perceived as being dumb. This is mainly due to the fact that, unfortunately, as an example, when comparing white people against black people on the ACTs, the 2015 ACT scores for African Americans were 17.1 compared to 22.4 for their white peers. The source I have actually goes on even further with things like
idiot.
It's okay if an actual human vlogger in the real world talks about this, like, okay, I don't know any vloggers. Let's say Oprah starts a vlogging show. She can talk about any racism that she's experienced with credibility because she's a real person. We can assume that she's honest about her life experiences, and we're to assume that her stories are true. Especially because there are real-world consequences if the stories are not true. Like when Jussie Smollett made up a fake hate crime.
Yay, Mr. Enter's comparing apples to oranges again. Jussie Smollett's fake story is not comparable to the stories that Nicki made in the Barbie PSA, because Jussie was a dumbass who decides to fake a crime and make everyone believe that because he was dissatisfied with his pay on the show Empire. Whereas the Barbie PSA story was completely harmless because we know that it's a fictional story, but they're doing it as a means to tell a moral of the story. And it's also used as a means towards relating other black viewers to white viewers, especially when we have incidents like that. The key differences are knowing when it's fake, but it's for telling a fictional story with a moral, and trying to be fake and getting people to believe that it was real in real life.
Give some of those drug PSAs credit. They often talked about what would have happened if you took drugs, not what did happen to fictional characters. Although, yes, some of them did fail on that regard. But, like, not one of these racism PSAs even takes that step. This is my biggest issue with the whole silence is violence mantra. It's not that you're compelling certain people that they have to speak up if they don't want to be branded a racist. It's because some people should shut up because they're stupid, and anything they say can actually hurt the fucking cause. There's actual racism in this world. If you deny that, you're a moron. But if you feel the need to make shit up, you're worse than a moron. We shouldn't have to make things up to tell the full story.
Wait, how is that in relation to silence is violence? Isn't silence is violence more about not speaking up about racism? Because when you kept quiet, then it tells other people that it's okay for racists to harass racial minorities? I don't know which is more stupid. The fact that you thought that silence is violence is more about making shit up, or the fact that you want to blame that quote/movement all because a hack of an actor decides to fake his story.
Anyway, I want to get all the Steven Universe PSAs in the same video, and considering we've already been here for half an hour, I think it's best to just end it here if I want to do that. So, good night, and good luck. This is part 5 of a commentary me and 8363MTR are doing on the mysterious Mr. Enter. If you have not seen the first 4 parts, I'd recommend doing so before going forward. Links to these parts below.
And speaking of that, it's the moment that you've all been waiting for. Steven Universe. Our grand finale. After June of 2020, Steven Universe made a bunch of PSAs, despite the fact that the show was actually over by that point. It's not as awkward as 16 coming back a decade later, but it still raised a couple of eyebrows. There's actually 6 of them by my last count. 3 of them are about racism, and they've teamed up with Dove to do 3 more self-esteem and body positivity PSAs. Dove, if you don't know, is a company that's so woke it had an ad of a black woman turning into a white woman in 2017. That wasn't so long ago. If you said something of that caliber in 2017, you'd be canceled by now.
You might even hear calls that you apologize for said comments, or threats that people will boycott you over said comments, which is also exactly what Dove got when this happened in 2017.
Anyway, the PSAs.
Who am I to say what an improvement is? Especially when it comes to something as personal as a gem's own form.
Got it, kids. Don't criticize shapeshifters.
Enter, can you stop being fucking obtuse for one fucking moment? Sorry, are you going to put me into a hole for saying this?
Okay, so there's actually a lot of issues with this point here, but most of it was actually taken by not only Becky Hopkins, but also other people who responded to this tweet on Twitter. So instead of taking the point about this here, let me showcase a new point. That being that he completely misses what the PSA is all about. So for the first 20 seconds of the PSA, Pearl talks about how she hasn't seen Bismuth in a while and how Bismuth has a new form. She could have said that she didn't like the form, or that she could say that it was an improvement, to which Bismuth say, "You didn't like the old one?" This is then what led to her saying this quote. The term form is actually in reference to when Pearl and the other gems would have different outfits, really. Gems have a humanoid shape, which are projections from their gemstones, which can can be changed at will, but with their only consistent feature being their gemstones and color schemes. These changes in forms usually happen when they either try to alter their form or when they regenerate. We can see this happen in Stephen the Sword Fighter, where before Pearl was fatally injured by the hologram Pearl, she wore a sleeveless sky blue top that had a yellow star and a translucent chest and transferred into a transparent silk ballet skirt around her waist, as well as a short salmon pink leggings, light green socks, and slip-on ballet flats to match. After her regeneration, she wore an aqua blue tunic with a small yellow star on the center of her chest, a lighter satin sash ribbon around her upper waist, amber leggings, pink socks, and pale blue slip-on ballet flats. The main problem that I have with Enter's point here is, well, even gems can have different forms, and yet he doesn't even acknowledge that, even with his sarcastic tone that he was trying to make. Another issue that I have is that after this quote, Bismuth decides to rant about how she was in a war, and complains to Pearl about how it's ridiculous about only talking about her forms instead. Pearl even agrees with it by giving out the actual message of what the PSA is supposed to be about. The actual message was that it was really more towards focusing on the person's achievements instead of their looks. That's what the PSA is really all about.
Let's do Pearl's first. Each PSA follows the same format. They're about to follow a traditional PSA, but they break the fourth wall to talk about, let's say, something else. Pearl's is the one that's most widely talked about because it most obviously gets facts wrong. And it's been so well worn that I don't think I have to get too deep into it. Like, you could probably go deeper into the facts about this on someone else's video.
Are we going to ask why kids are apparently learning about Thomas Edison?
Honestly, I don't get the battle that they chose to fight here. Thomas Edison's fame has waned over the years. He ain't as popular as he used to be, and in most online discourse at least, he's known as a con artist. Like, Thomas Edison patented a lot of ideas from Nikola Tesla. He also killed an elephant, so you'd be hard-pressed to find a person today who thinks as highly as they did of him even back in the 2000s. Thomas Edison certainly had contributions, but the Wizard of Menlo isn't all that magical these days.
Even though if we mostly take what the PSA said and some of it taken to what I've researched on, Louis Latimer provided the key component of the light bulb, which is the improvement of the carbon filament and not necessarily being a new original idea. But yet, Edison was fully created for the invention of the light bulb, which involved everything including the filament, which is inside our history textbooks without Louis's name in there. That's essentially what Pearl is talking about. In fact, I really love that Enter decides to cut some context out, because before she said that, she was talking about Louis Latimer, you know, in relation to Thomas Edison. I get that Edison's a major con artist, like you said, and I also understand that Louis Latimer didn't actually invent the original concept of the light bulb's filament, but only improved on it. Though I find it funny that people would want to state that he didn't invent it when people didn't learn about what an improvement patent is, as well as how inventions are rarely original or are mainly more towards trying to improve the original one. But it's like, nice to know that you want to take the original message / point that they're trying to convey out and talk about something else about the PSA, because they were talking about how they're not crediting a black inventor who helped with the light bulb, not just with Thomas Edison.
With that said, Mr. Enter is right that Thomas Edison sucks. All my homies hate Thomas Edison.
Thomas Edison could get canceled on Twitter.
Also, the fact that people in general don't like Edison still doesn't defeat the PSA's point, which is at least people know who he is. For reference, if I said that the most prolific serial killer in United States history was Samuel Little, as opposed to the more well-known Charles Manson, Ted Bundy, or John Wayne Gacy, am I therefore saying that white Americans really like John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, and Charles Manson? Well, obviously not.
There were black Roman warriors, black medieval knights, black classical musicians, black cowboys, black fighter pilots. Where are they?
Okay, so I guess that you're in a world history class and not an American history class, which usually starts with the Fertile Crescent. You know, in Africa and the Middle East.
Actually, of the countries that are currently where the Fertile Crescent was, only one of them is located in Africa, that being Egypt. The rest, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Kuwait, Turkey, Iran, and Cyprus, are all in Asia, not Africa. Now, John is technically right in that all those countries are in either Africa or the Middle East, but Africa's role was so small that it's more or less a historical footnote, especially considering the point being made is that schools do not educate enough about the history of black people. None of the countries that I listed have black people as their primary population. Instead, it's mostly Arabs. And I hate to inform you this, John, but Arabs are not black. Well, okay, I guess unless we're using the paper bag test, but I would not recommend doing that.
Even ignoring that, history gets truncated in classes. Like, even the big events, like World War II, we don't learn every single nuance. Like, it's pretty bad when a channel called Oversimplified goes into more detail about major historical events like the American Civil War than our own actual education system does.
Like, okay, John, did you, rewatch Clueless before, writing your script for this video? Because, you're saying, an awful lot for no reason. But to actually address your point, the issue at hand is not these omissions in of themselves. Things have to be omitted if you don't want history textbooks to be literally 1,000,000 pages long. The issue at hand is the pattern of omissions and specifically why things are omitted. It's one thing to write a history book and omit insignificant people and stories. That is perfectly fine. It is another if these people who are being omitted consistently tend to be people of certain races. And if the stories being omitted happen to be the stories of certain races.
But second of all, and more to the point, I don't know about whatever school you're teaching, but my school actually did go into black musicians. We learned about the Harlem Renaissance, the invention of jazz, Louis Armstrong, all of that. I'm genuinely curious here. Did they take that stuff out of the textbooks and I just don't know it? Or maybe it's a regional thing, like how deep Texas gets into the Alamo?
She said black classical musicians, not black musicians of any kind. Did you not pay attention to class again? She was talking about black classical composers such as William Grant Still or Florence Price. Or heck, even one black classical musician that's possibly considered to be as the first classical composer of African origins, that being Joseph Belloni, or Xavier de St. Georges. Or if you really want to dub him as something, as Black Mozart. Granted, I honestly wish that Pearl could have said black classical composers instead of black classical musicians, but how did you miss the extra detailed word that she said here?
Bro, how can you say my school didn't teach me about black people? Do you know how much Kanye most of us listened to?
Oh yeah, and her did state that he might be president someday. I'd rather have Kim Kardashian as president.
Oh, and as for Enter's question about if it's a regional thing, like the phrase steamed hams, it actually is. In fact, multiple states do not mandate mentions of slavery in their curriculums, including in reference to the Civil War.
As for the Roman warriors, yes, there were black Roman warriors because their society wasn't race-based, and they conquered parts of Africa. This means, in addition to having black Roman warriors, the Romans also had white slaves. Look, sorry, they told me to tell the whole story, so I'm just doing what they said.
I mean, that's cool and all, but I fail to see how this is to counter why Pearl's statement is wrong here. Both of you agreed that there's black Roman warriors, but Pearl took it a step further by asking, why aren't we acknowledging them more in our school history textbooks? Was it that Romans did not have the same views on race as we do today, along with white slaves supposed to be a dunk? If so, then it's too bad your statements were irrelevant like most of your anecdotal points you used to counter the raised question.
With that said, you're right, John. Many Roman warriors were black, or at least dark-skinned. Now, I want everyone watching this video to Google Roman warriors and look at the images brought up. Tell me, how many of you got people so white you'd think they're Christian rappers? Because I did. Here are some examples. Also, I like how John treats mentioning the idea that the Romans had white slaves as this thing that the anti-racists don't want you to know. But in my experience, the people who identify as anti-racists typically say that the concept of race, as we think of it today, was thought up whole cloth by Americans to justify the practice of chattel slavery against Africans. Therefore, if you told them that the Romans had white slaves, they would not only not be surprised, but they'd probably call that sentence somewhat incoherent, considering the Romans didn't have a notion of white people.
I worry about you humans because you only live, what, about 100 years?
Haven't you been on this planet for like 600? Why haven't you done anything about slavery or civil rights or anything like this? I reiterate, having a fictional character make a PSA about this kind of thing is stupid, especially when in-universe they have the power to actually do something about it. But no, Pearl is just gonna sit back and watch for hundreds of fucking years and then shame us about her inability to do shit.
Look, that's basically within the overall realms of pure speculations. It is true that the Crystal Gems did at least spend some time on Earth within the last few centuries after the war. What's also true was that before the 3 other diamonds fled, they launched one final attack which resulted in the corruptions of all gems left on the planet, with the exception of Rose, Garnet, and Pearl as the only survivors. What's not confirmed was whether or not if Pearl and the rest of the Crystal Gems even knew that slavery was happening in the US, or even if they had any participation or knowledge towards the US Civil War. In fact, besides Buddy Bodwick, we have no idea whether or not they even contacted other humans, possibly even outside of Beach City, until Greg came around, fucked Pink Diamond, and she gave birth to Steven while at the same time dying in the process. Oh yeah, and then something about how it takes place in an alternative timeline in their world, with the exception of a different state name or whatnot. We don't know if slavery between humans even happened in this alternative history. But, okay, let's pretend that not only did slavery existed back in that timeline, but they knew about it for just 1 sec. There are still a lot of issues with this point. First of all, the Crystal Gems are stuck in Beach City as they're busy trying to contain the corrupted gems and continue to protect humanity. I don't think that she would have a lot of free time in her hands. Secondly, even if for whatever reason that Pearl had all of the free time in the world, she's just one gem, one female gem that would be plagued with misogyny that even wouldn't bode her well as her being an alien in one location out of several in the US, of millions of people. Not even Jesus Christ can try to convince everybody, and even his teachings were warped after he was crucified. What really makes you think that she, a female alien, would still try to convince the entire population in the US that, hey, racism is bad, in fact slavery is bad too, don't do it? Exactly, so why are you putting that kind of pressure on her when she already has enough on her plate?
Okay, now I'm just imagining the Crystal Gems calling John C. Calhoun White Diamond, and I'm grinning like a dumbass at that.
Was this modified to make white readers comfortable?
Yes, my school made us watch the film Roots, when we were learning about when our American forefathers partook in the atrocity that is slavery, to make us more comfortable as white people. We learned about the Trail of Tears, read Farewell to Manzanar, you know, the book about the internment of the Japanese citizens during World War II. We learned about the American Civil Rights Movement, with the Alabama bus boycott and the teachings of Martin Luther King, and how they got blasted by fire hoses for trying to earn their rights. And yes, while a lot of individual accomplishments by individual people have been sidelined, I never got the impression that my history class is trying to make me feel comfortable as a white person. Wherever that fucking notion came from. American history had a lot of race-based atrocities, which are repeatedly taught to us throughout our entire education.
Oh god. Holy shit, Enter, you really don't pay attention in class, do you? Pearl wasn't stating that we should not talk about the mistreatment of black people or other minorities back then in greater detail. She was mainly saying that we have been ignoring many of the individual's black achievements and accomplishments throughout history. I mean, if you really want to talk about how we haven't fully taught students in the US about everything, then I could go on and on about neo-slavery, how exactly we've treated the Native Americans during the Trail of Tears, such as drowning babies if they cried too loud enough, the overall inception of slavery back then, and plenty of other atrocities in the US. But really, I could be here all day again, so at the most, you're pretty much misinterpreting Pearl again.
Alright, Garnet, you're up next. Hers is probably the least out of all of them. It's bad for the reasons that the drug PSAs were.
Do you know of any other failed PSA attempts throughout the rest of human history?
Stuff like this doesn't actually happen in real life.
Whoa there.
Are you kidding? It totally does.
Just because this has never happened to you doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
Oh, wow. I'm sorry. Seriously, I didn't know.
Stuff like this doesn't happen. Actually, it does. Whoa, I had no idea. I'm sorry. If you've managed to convince anyone on Earth to not be racist this easy, please let me know. Like, seriously. From what I understand, actual racists are kinda more entrenched in their fucked up beliefs. And it takes more than a slight scolding to get them out of it. I mean, if it's this easy, I guess people just don't want to try to fight racism. Seriously, I want to live in your world where all of this is this simple. Man hates black person for 50 years, but just talk to him for 2 seconds, and he's a changed man.
John, we get it! Move on already!
See what I'm getting at? It's not that simple. And the cartoon that these characters live in is not our world.
Are there people under some kind of contrary impression?
Gee, it's almost as if these PSAs are meant for kids, and that the character is a kid who's still developing. Something in which case the Enter completely forgot.
Anyway, he begins his review of the Amethyst one with comments that do not actually add anything to discussion, so I'm just cutting those out.
I just think it's messed up to compare me being an alien to you two being different races.
Why are you looking at me?
John, she's looking at the camera, like you're doing right now.
Ephrom, Enter meant why is his audience looking at him funny?
Well, even then, that doesn't make much sense because I'm watching John's video. Of course I'm looking at him. Where am I supposed to look? My wall? My co-op partner?
That's a little bit creepy.
I mean, I wouldn't really call his point creepy, but if that's how you feel...
No, I meant when you're staring at me like that. Stop it! You're getting a bit personal with my space bubble.
Oh, my mistake then?
Was anyone comparing black people to space alien? I mean, I agree that's kind of fucked up. It sounds like some the elites are lizard shit, but I haven't noticed anyone but you doing that.
Okay, so this actually goes on for quite a while. Seriously, Enter, cut down your rants, please. So I'm actually just gonna interject here. In all honesty, this might be yet another instance where you're cutting out context again, to the point where you're missing the point, even if you might be a bit sarcastic with it. Amethyst was talking about how it's dumb/weird to compare all kinds of human races to her. Both of the children agree, and the white girl and black girl said this.
Well, I'm not an alien, but it definitely matters to me that I'm black. Yeah, it makes a difference that I'm white. I know the two of us get treated very differently.
I just think it's messed up to compare me being an alien to you two being different races. You're both human. You're totally biologically the same. Adding purple people into a lesson about human racism makes no sense.
Yeah, that is pretty weird. I think people like the black, white, or purple thing because adding a fantasy race in there helps distract from the actual racism black people have to deal with. Right. My experience with anti-black racism is really specific. Other people of color experience other forms of racism too, but you won't see any of that if you don't see color.
In other words, they weren't literally comparing black people to aliens. They were saying adding a fictional race is not helping things out because it distracts us from actual races/colors like black, brown, or Asian, especially when you say stuff like we're all the same on the inside.
And then we get the very, very problematic tagline. Can I just say that this is ableist to colorblind people and go home?
And this, ladies and gentlemen, is what is known as the funny haha mistake that Enter makes. Yes, I get that this is a joke, but considering that points can be presented behind said joke, I frankly don't care. Actually, colorblind people do see differences when it comes to figuring out people's race. The most common colorblindness is when people can't see the color red, which is usually hard to tell when someone's getting a sunburn, and I would imagine that they can tell very easily. Even the most severe case of colorblindness, which only allows you to see black, white, and every 50 shades of gray in between, can let you pick out which race is which, albeit with maybe a very small added difficulty. The thing about it is that it depends on how light or dark your skin is, so colors that aren't white, black, or gray rarely had a part at all in this.
Okay, so what's the difference between not being racist and being anti-racist? Because, believe it or not, there is a difference. And this is where things get dirty. Anti-racism is actually this big, complex thing with a lot of nuances. Surprisingly so, considering the term. But it goes beyond just not being racist. If you just don't be racist, anti-racist people think you're ignoring the problem. And by ignoring the problem, you are a part of the problem. And you might as well be racist.
No, they believe that individual people not being racist isn't going to inherently fix all of the systemic issues that lead to racial inequality. Obviously, you should not be racist. However, everybody waking up tomorrow and deciding not to be racist would not change the fact that throughout history, a lot of people have been racist. And they've created systems that perpetuate that racism. And that is not going to be fixed just by people not being racist. It's going to be fixed via targeted action.
Being anti-racist means that you need to look at a black person and assume that they have a bunch of cultural baggage thrown on them for the sake of being black. Doesn't matter if it's a black homeless person on the street or Obama.
You know, the man who people seriously speculated could have been a secret Muslim born in Kenya. John, what would I call that other than baggage based on his race?
Sea color. What do you think that means? What else could it mean? Unless you believe that there is one unifying feature or experience that affects every individual member of a group, that individual experiences don't exist. Anti-racism isn't anti as in antibacterial. It's anti-racism like anti-villain, where the person in question is still a villain. They're just being villainous towards a bad person. Anti-racism is being racist, but in a positive direction. That sounds a little bit fucked up, don't you think? And I'm betting a good deal of you guys don't believe me on this one.
Gee, you think? Maybe it's because you should invest in a dictionary for once. You're using the wrong definition of anti here. It's not unlike the conventional form, it's opposed to or against. Why mention anti-villain when that's not the correct anti that's being used for anti-racist, especially when anti-racists are against racism?
I want to tell you something. Last year, California had a proposition ballot. Prop 16. The media reported on it as the affirmative action bill. What it would do, and all it would do, is repeal Prop 209. What is Prop 209? Proposition 209 prevents state discrimination based on sex, race, or ethnicity. And in 2020, the most left-leaning state in the nation put up a proposition bill to basically repeal their civil rights law. Voting yes on Prop 16 is what is demanded and required to be anti-racist. If Prop 16 passed, someone could easily have a whites-only restaurant and it would be legal under California law. But no, it's about affirmative action. It's about giving downtrodden people a leg up so you can feel good and appeal to your white savior syndrome. Prop 16 didn't pass, by the way. It was close, 57% to 43.
That isn't close. That's a 14% margin of difference.
Also, you say that Proposition 209 was about, and I quote, prevent state discrimination based on race, sex, or ethnicity, when that's not the full picture. Proposition 209 is actually a proposition that prohibits government institutions from considering race, sex, or ethnicity, specifically in the areas of public employment, public contracting, and public education. And to give a quick crash course of affirmative action, the definition of it is the practice or policy of favoring individuals belonging to groups known to have been discriminated against previously, and that's in relations in the context of the allocation of resources or employment. How exactly is this in relations to someone can have a whites-only restaurant? In fact, what do you mean by this? By customers or by employers? If by customers, to which I highly doubt that you would mean this, but who freaking knows these days, then this isn't within the affirmative action. That's just being discriminatory by segregating the customer's race. If by employers, then you really don't know affirmative action, as affirmative action is when employers are more likely to hire more black people or more women in that workplace. That's what they've essentially meant by that. And before anybody asks or before Enter for whatever reason decides to make a separate point in relation to the affirmative action, yes, I am aware of one of the talking points about Asians being discriminated against within their enrollment process for colleges, but I did find something interesting, which is in relation to the topic that Enter is talking about. One of the key components against affirmative action is that after California passed Proposition 209, some people are claiming that more Asians are enrolling in Ivy schools like UC Berkeley. However, the issue with that was that it was actually cherry-picked, as they don't take into account the admissions rate. After Proposition Proposition 209 passed, Asians were actually accepted less at these schools between 1998 to 2009. With the exception of UC Riverside for whatever reason, but it is considered to be a small increase instead. Sure, that doesn't mean that there can be discrimination against Asians at these college campuses, but it does paint a picture about how conservatives would like to use Asians for being victims of affirmative action for whatever reason. Also, sorry for the nitpick, but California is the most left-leaning state in the nation? On what grounds? By population? Well, tell that to places like Massachusetts with 39% or Washington with 31% of the population being liberal. By laws? Well, how come before the 2020 election, when Democrats hold the majority in statewide offices in the legislature, they haven't passed a bill about single-payer healthcare or to strip cops who end up committing serious offenses? They say that they don't have the overall votes, therefore they don't hold these votes, but that's besides the point here. By policies as a group by civilians in that state? Well, you yourself said that they didn't pass Prop 16 here, which meant that Republicans did their jobs in convincing people to not vote yes on the matter, even with the fact that it was close. I seriously don't get why you've called California out for supposedly being the most left-leaning state in the nation when you're actually wrong on that.
Also, I like how John talks about how the most left-leaning state in the nation tried to repeal its civil rights laws, as if this is an example of anti-racism gone mad, and not just an example of it being incredibly easy to get a proposition on the ballot in the state of California. For reference, Prop 16 was one of 11 different propositions subject to direct statewide referendum on that ballot in 2020. California's large population, put together with its left-leaning government, essentially means that any idea can get a referendum if its followers are dedicated enough. I mean, for fuck's sake, John, this is the same state that allowed Lyndon LaRouche to put a proposition on the ballot that more or less would have led to quarantining people with AIDS. Twice.
I absolutely understand that there are black people who've had experiences that I could never imagine going through. I know this because I talk to them and treat them as individuals. Same with Asians, Indians, Hispanics, Polynesians, Native Americans, so I can understand their worldviews better. But no, you people want to take a shortcut and assume that all of these people have had the same life experiences, which strikes me as kinda racist.
Yes, John, treating all people as if they are literally identical, like they're the fucking Borg from Star Trek, is wrong. Who the hell says you... I don't know what you're attacking. I genuinely don't. I have heard tons of different anti-racist arguments, and I haven't even agreed with all of them. There have been some I thought were terrible. I've never heard one say, you have to treat all black people like they're a fucking hive mind.
You know who's very good at seeing color? You know who does it a lot? It's actually their primary feature. The alt-right. Their entire political ideology is about seeing color. And these kind of PSAs might just be good recruiting tools for them.
Hitler also ate sugar. What the fuck is your point, John? Or are you seriously going to tell me that when Martin Luther King Jr. saw color and George Wallace saw color, the exact same things were occurring?
Okay, I'm going to be completely honest here. When I first saw the video, I was flabbergasted when I reached this point. Essentially, when showing this point to other people in the Cloud Palace, I had one reaction image where the picture stated, Narnia, the lion, the witch, and the audacity of this bitch. So, I'm not gonna waste any more time here. John, this was considered to be the worst point that you made in this video. The problem with this is that this is the worst time that you've missed the overall point. Not just towards you making a faulty comparison between anti-racist and the alt-right, but within your entire rant about anti-racist. Anti-racist essentially means that you're actively seeking out racism. They recognize that most marginalized people will experience issues of systemic and institutional racism and oppression. The alt-right, on the other hand, actively reinforces racism. Like, unless if you're someone like Candace Owens, are people of color considered to be in the alt-right because they see color, or that they see the reality that there's other colors in our skin out there?
Here's the thing. Some of the most racist shit that I have ever seen and heard has actually come from anti-racist activists. Like, there was this big story last year. The Smithsonian National Museum of African American History had a chart last year. It was controversial because it was on whiteness. And I can't put this on this video because it is one of the most racist things that I've ever seen. Not towards white people. It was racist towards black people. They literally stated that things like having a plan for the future, believing hard work is the key to success, and objective, rational, linear thinking, and viewing time as commodity were all a part of whiteness, as intrinsic to white people and no one else. It is clear to me, undeniably, that racism is alive and well. Unfortunately, it's endemic in the people who are claiming to fight it.
Yes, there has been plenty of examples of anti-racist activists doing a thing that was unintentionally racist. However, most of these were, at the very best, people being dumb, or at the very least, not seeing the bigger picture. They are not, however, the main reason why racism is still alive to this very day. The difference between anti-racist and actual racist in this specific scenario is that anti-racists will sometimes make unintentional racist remarks or actions, whereas actual racists makes intentional remarks or actions. I mean, shit dude, did you see Charlottesville, or what was known as the Unite the Right rally back in August of 2017? Or how about the rise of far-right extremists, not just in America, but also in Europe, which also includes Germany too. Like, the main reason why the N-word, you know, the same word that's derogatory towards black people, holds power to this day is because of all of these horrid racist dickheads who's still using it. Not because of some dumbasses who wants to support black people, but yet fucked up with the most moronic of ways. In other words, bigotry is being kept alive by bigots, not by people making legitimate mistakes. In fact, the museum apologized, and they were being sincere about it after listening to people talking about how it was unintentionally racist. Why are you deciding to blame shift here? Also, just because that there's more unintentional racism doesn't negate the intentional acts of it. The most you can do with the unintentional racism is point out their actions, which, guess what? Those people apologize anyways, so the issue was solved.
I also want to point out, I know the chart Enter is talking about never once did it declare that any of the values it listed as white or black were good or bad. It more just noted that they were differences within the cultures of black Americans versus the cultures of white Americans. Cultures here referring to the general attitude that people of the races have, not necessarily how each individual person of said race would think. Like, serious question, John. Do you think this is the height of racism?
Yo, check this out. Black guys drive a car like this. Ding ding. Yeah, but white guys, see, they drive a car like this.
A lot of this stuff from these anti-racist activists sound almost exactly like what I hear from the alt-right. And I would not be surprised if the people who made the Arthur or the Steven Universe or the Barbie PSA believe this shit.
So you wouldn't be surprised if the people who made these works believed the moral of their creations. Well, neither would I. Are you normally under a contrary impression?
When these people say to see color and want to remove laws that protect minorities, I don't think they have anyone's best interest at heart, except their own. And it feels like they've hijacked the movement for something incredibly awful.
John, you do know that a lot of prominent anti-racists are black, right? In fact, you mentioned Prop 16 earlier in the video. The primary sponsor of that was California Assemblywoman Shirley Weber, who is the head of the Legislative Black Caucus in California.
Racism is bad. Discrimination is bad. Okay. So, little robot dude, you got anything?
My name is Al, like it says on my body.
I think that's AI.
I have robo-dyslexia. Lowercase L's look exactly like uppercase I's to me.
Oh, so that's what your name is. Well, hi Al. Question: why didn't you introduce yourself in the beginning of the video? Yeah, Enter, I honestly wish that when you're introducing your characters, unless if they're supposed to be mysterious like with your other character, Old Man, or if there's any other form of nuances in there, it really should have been best to introduce your character at the start of the video rather than at the end. The way that you've handled Al in the video was so confusing that originally I didn't want to bring it up at first because of how, oh, you've introduced him at the end. But it doesn't work considering that the writing was pretty bad to begin with. Here's what I would have done instead, and I'm going to be playing as Enter, while my co-op partner Ephrom will be playing Al.
Buckle up. It's going to be a long, winding road today, and I think we need something really simple to get started with. What is the least controversial topic that we can start with today?
Global warming.
Who the fuck are you, and how did you get into my house?
Oh, sorry. I was going to knock, but as you can see, I do not have arms.
I mean, I can clearly see that, but that doesn't answer my question.
Your front door was open. Also, I did try yelling, but you apparently didn't listen to me. Story of my life. Decided to listen to you after a while and see what you were talking about.
Okay, nice to know that you can barge in here without any of our knowledge then. That does raise a good concern that I should be starting to lock up my doors. That still doesn't answer my question of who you are.
Oh, that name's Al. Like what it says on the front plate right here. Dumbass.
Don't you mean AI?
I have robot dyslexia. And yes, we robots call all of our conditions Robot X. Just like how humans call all their conditions Human X.
That makes sense, I guess. So, you're just going to help me out?
Yes.
Alright, just don't get in the way. Now, what was I talking about again?
Global warming.
You see, a better way of introducing your own main character.
Especially with my characterization, which, let's be real here, really brought the whole sketch together. I expect to be nominated for a Saturn Award.
Okay, Al, anything you got?
This whole thing makes me think of a C.S. Lewis quote.
Is it the one that I'm thinking of?
Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. They may be more likely to go to heaven, yet at the same time likelier to make a hell of earth. This very kindness stings with intolerable insult. To be cured against one's will and cured of states which we may not regard as disease is to be put on a level of those who have not yet reached the age of reason, or those who never will. To be classed with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals.
Fun fact for those who don't know, the entire quote came from God in the Dock, Essays in Theology and Ethics. This could have meant that this quote was in relation to Christianity, where people might be too righteous to wrongfully control a population, via as a cult or as an actual government for their own greater good. Could also be about how people might abuse their power in church or in general too. Honestly, I could be wrong about the Christianity part, but either way, I find it kinda ironic that Enter's quoting something in relation to Christianity when he's an atheist. In other words, I think that he's taken this quote out of context.
In fact, actually reading the essay from God in the Docks, where Enter got this quote from, it's primarily about those who want to change the justice system away from just punishments and in favor of other concepts, such as deterrence or rehabilitation. With Lewis saying that doing so would remove the humanity away from those who are worthy of punishment, and saying that doing so could easily lead to a situation where a cabal of experts make decisions that the public is unable to criticize, and that could easily lead to a scary place. In fact, here is what Lewis says directly before the part John quoted. The punishment of an innocent, that is, an undeserving man, is wicked only if we grant the traditional view that righteous punishment means deserved punishment. Once we have abandoned that criterion, all punishments have to be justified, if at all, on other grounds that have nothing to do with desert. Where the punishment of the innocent can be justified on those grounds, and it could, in some cases, be justified as a deterrent, it would be no less moral than any other punishment. any distaste for it is on the part of a humanitarian will be merely a hangover from the retributive theory. It is indeed important to notice that my argument so far supposes no evil intentions on the part of the humanitarian, and considers only what is involved in the logic of his position. My contention is that good men, not bad men, consistently acting upon that position would act as cruelly and as unjustly as the greatest tyrants. They might in some respects even act worse. This is where the part John quoted comes in. And afterwards, Lewis goes on to make it clear that he's talking about how a retributive model of justice is the least likely one to be abused, even noting that although many of his fellow Christians believe that it would be more just to move to another model, they have to keep in mind that the only way such a system could remain moral in his eyes is through the unreasonable idea that we could be perpetually governed by an oligarchy of enlightened theocrats. But to be punished, however severely, because we have deserved it, because we ought to have known better, is to be treated as a human person made in God's image. In reality, however, we must face the possibility of a bad ruler armed with a humanitarian theory of punishment. A great many popular blueprints for a Christian society are merely what the Elizabethans called egg and moonshine, because they assume that the whole society is Christian or that the Christians are in control. This is not so in most contemporary states. Even if it were, our rulers would still be fallen men, and therefore neither very wise or good. As it is, they will usually be unbelievers. And since wisdom and virtue are not the only or the commonest qualifications for a place in the government, they will not often be even the best unbelievers. The practical problem of Christian politics is not that of drawing up schemes for a Christian society, but that of living as innocently as we can with an unbelieving fellow subjects under unbelieving rulers who will never be perfectly wise and good, and who will sometimes be very wicked and very foolish. And when they are wicked, the humanitarian theory of punishment will put in their hands a finer instrument of tyranny than the wickedness ever had before. I could go on, but I think you all get the point. The fact is, Enter ripped this quote from context and applied it to a series of incredibly different discussions. We're going to be stopping here because all that's left is him making an outro and showing off his list of patrons. With that, we're going to move on to our final thoughts. MTR, you first.
Okay, so let me first talk about the overall politics side of the video first, as the animation side is going to be a bit longer, and part of me thinks that Ephrom will talk about the politics side in more detail. Look, I am not saying that you should change your political ideology to become a leftist. If you truly believe that you want to be a centered libertarian, then while I will disagree with some of the political takes that you've made, I am not going to stop you. What I do have an issue for, however, is that you really don't know how to argue. You've essentially made a straw man from the other side into thinking that this is what left-leaning people are talking about, but you don't really have any actual proof that anybody from the left, or hell, the consensus that the liberals or the leftists made towards points like these. Now, as for the animation side of the video, it honestly reminds me of some of his previous videos about how he reviews the show, that being that he's way too strict when it comes to reviewing, or that he takes the cartoon way too seriously, or even the fact that he prefers one way over the other. Now, look, I can completely understand when it comes to reviewers that they're giving out their own personal opinion or preferences. I am not arguing about that whatsoever. What I do have an issue with, however, is when he's passing it off as if we need to have these rules/guidelines on how to do animation, or heck, anything when it comes down to any kind of medium overall, such as with the overall case of animated characters looking at the camera directly, or trying to use a fictional story to present an argument, or heck, the overall fact that he missed a key and crucial detail about a piece that he's reviewing. What I also have an issue with too is that you've completely missed some of the overall key details about the PSAs in episodes 2. Things such as how you don't know about the target demographic for some of them, how you've left out some of the key details of the animated work, like with your point about the characters in 16 saying the word millennials over and over again, when you've missed why they're saying that, and not doing any kind of research on why Doug the character is considered to be white within the first place. Part of me wants to even argue that it shows to me that you don't know the show/episode that you're reviewing. Now, because of Enter's video being a year old, a fan of Enter could argue that he's gotten better over the years since this video release, and honestly, even ignoring that it's missing my overall point about how I reviewed the video to be the worst video out there, for the sake of tackling the argument, I find the reviews of Strange Magic and Dork Hunters from Outer Space to be okay. There's nothing in which case I have a huge issue on. But then there's some of his other reviews, such as his Turning Red is a mixed bag review, and no, there's more issues other than the 9/11 take, or that his real point was that it doesn't count for the time period of the movie, which I hugely disagree on that. The Good Family, while him reviewing the show in itself is fine, I am getting sick and tired of him talking about how bad the left-leaning people are. And then finally his Little Ellen review, where not only he was making a mountain of a molehill for the art style of the show, but also got into the voice actor's case, one of which is probably a child, about how they don't sound like children without providing as to how they can fix the issue at hand. Which, yes, Entrev went ahead and made a sly comment about Ellen's mother being a speech therapist, but still. I think he could have, at the very least, handled it a whole lot better. Yeah, no. I would say no towards him getting better, because if he is truly getting better, then he would honestly try to make sure that he doesn't repeat the same mistakes again or not make new ones. In fact, because of this, I am honestly not a fan of Enter at this point on, because he himself in his overall content is honestly a roller coaster ride, and I am glad that I got off of it a few years ago. But yet, I would still consider this as the worst video that Enter made, and is honestly one of the worst videos that I've watched so far. The main reason why I say this is because both of the elements of you reviewing an animated piece, or pieces in this case, and you taking a political hot take without citing any of your sources is considered to be the worst of both worlds. Now, I would have ended this with I don't have a unique critique for you considering that everyone has given you some advice on how to improve, but then I remember the second worst point that you've made. The one about how you've showed off a graph from the lockdown protests and gun buyer source. At this point, I would say that you and your team should have checked out the sources that you've presented and see if it agrees with the overall point that you're trying to make or not. Otherwise, when people do decide to check out your sources, they won't have to call you out for supposedly not reading the full source. Otherwise, just look back at the advice that you were given, because it sounds to me that you haven't even done that. And with that, Ephrom, you have the floor. Have a wonderful journey through the depths of space and time, but I must be off.
I want to begin with this. Unlike MTR, I am still a fan of Mr. Enter, and I have been for almost a decade. He is the reason I started watching shows like Friendship is Magic, Dan vs. Futurama, and probably more I'm forgetting at the moment. Even when I disagreed with him, and I haven't always agreed with him, I normally thought he tackled political and social issues in a nuanced and complicated way while making his opinions clear. He's even taught me countless things just from watching and reading his works. With that said, if Enter's normal work is King of the Hill, this is the Good Family, to use a comparison Enter himself would understand. To begin with, I don't even really feel like this could be accurately called a review. Enter doesn't so much review the PSAs as he does dismiss them to go on societal rants. And as a collage of stand-up-esque ramblings, loosely put together via the framing device of these PSAs, it's still fucking terrible. On every level. His points are commonly inaccurate, and his primary targets seem to not even really be actual people so much as the voices inside his head. It doesn't really feel like he's saying anything because he's not talking to anyone. He's talking to a wall that he's convinced himself has some kind of liberal opposition. And for that matter, he's primarily arguing with said opposition based off of facts he misremembered that he first heard 10 years ago. Enter said in his intro he respected his audience too much to make this just be him laughing at silly corniness, and yet it felt like he primarily wanted to do that. Again, hence why the PSAs were barely reviewed. Now, mind you, I understand that Animated Atrocities is a fundamentally caustic series, and I'm not expecting Enter to necessarily drop his caustic demeanor specifically for this one video, in most cases. However, again, if Enter wants to sell this video as him respecting his audience, then he did a terrible job. Actual respect would have involved taking on these issues in a nuanced and complex way, as opposed to the very simplistic and myopic one that he gave us. The biggest issue I have with this video is that I know John is smarter than this. And, you know, as a political commentator who often talks about other political commentators, I occasionally get asked what the worst political take I've ever seen was. And truth be told, I don't measure takes like that. I'm going to be honest with you guys. I am not bothered by a stupid person just ranting off their opinions. I'm being serious. I'm not bothered by somebody saying the most they physically can know, even if they're incorrect, because the person is stupid. They don't know any better. If I honestly believed John was stupid, I would still have issues with this video, but it wouldn't be worth spending multiple hours commentating on it. The reason I hate this video is because I know John is smart, and therefore these errors can only be described by either pretentiousness on his part or condescension. John is a know-nothing know-it-all in this video. That's the only way I can properly describe it. And the fact that he is commonly wrong makes this one of the, the single most frustrating video I've ever covered. Not necessarily the worst, but the most frustrating. Good night and good luck.